At 65, my own son drugged me and abandoned me on a frozen island off the coast of Alaska to seize my shipping empire, all to take over the empire I had built over 40 years, and he planned it all himself with his wife as his accomplice. But my son never knew that the old naval watch on my wrist was more than just a family heirloom. While he moved through the darkness orchestrating his father's murder, each and every word he spoke was captured on tape. That desolate spit of ice was where I expected to die until a woman materialized out of the fog, a bow gripped in her hand. Her eyes locked hard on my name, and the words she spoke rooted me to the ground. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here. If stories like this one speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the ones still to come. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from right now and what time is it there? There's something about hearing a story like this in the quiet hours that makes it land differently. A word before we start: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the truth underneath that matters. The December wind tears across the Columbia River estuary like something with an edge. I'm sitting out on the deck of my 38-foot sailboat, alone, the water black beneath me, the sky blacker still above. My name is Warren Holt, 65 years old. 6 months back, my son made an attempt on my life, left me stranded on an island in Alaska. I'm going to tell you how I walked away from it, not the survival itself. That part is grim and ordinary. Cold hunger sleeping inside caves, everything you'd expect from a man dumped on a frozen rock 400 miles from the nearest living soul. What's worth telling is what I set in motion before my son ever got me there. The decisions I made in the weeks and months ahead of that June night when he put me ashore on that beach and sailed away, because I didn't know everything, but I knew enough. It began in June 6 months ago. My son Nolan came through the door of my corporate office on the 40th floor of Pioneer Tower on Southwest 5th Avenue in downtown Portland. He was holding an expensive bottle of bourbon and wearing a smile I hadn't seen cross his face in 3 years. Nolan Holt, 38 years old, vice president of the shipping corporation I had assembled from nothing across 4 decades. My only son. "Dad," he said, placing the bottle down on my desk. "I want to take you somewhere." I looked at him. Really looked. He carried my build from 30 years back, 6 feet broad shoulders, the kind of frame that holds its ground on a heaving deck. His mother's eyes, though, dark, quick, always running calculations behind them. "What kind of trip?" I asked. "Alaska," he said. "Just the 2 of us. The yacht, no phones, no meetings, no corporate noise. I want to learn how to read ocean currents from you again like when I was 8. That mention of 8 years old landed exactly where he meant it to. I remembered Nolan at that age, perched on my shoulders on the deck of our first vessel, asking why the sky shifted color before a storm rolled in. I remembered being young enough to think my son would grow into someone I'd know. When I asked him when, he said, "Next week, 4 days, maybe 5, there's a cove near the Panhandle I've been scouting. Perfect for fishing, perfect for just talking." I looked into my son's eyes and saw what I'd spent 3 years refusing to see. The warmth was rehearsed. The smile was a habit. He was after something, and it had nothing to do with ocean currents. I said yes, regardless, not out of belief, but because I wanted to be wrong. 3 days before we were set to leave, I was awake at 5 in the morning and out in my workshop behind the house. The workshop is where the things I actually value live: old maritime charts, my grandfather's sextant instruments from my first captaincy 4 decades ago, and my grandfather's watch. It's a marine chronometer built in 1983 by a Swiss watchmaker who crafted instruments for deep-sea vessels. My grandfather wore it crossing the Pacific in 1951. My father wore it captaining freight routes to Japan. I wore it on every voyage until I became too desk-bound to go to sea. The watch rests in a leather case lined with felt. I lifted it out and held it heavier than anything modern. Solid brass and steel, the face aged to yellow, but the mechanism still running clean. I had made changes to it the previous October. Nothing visible from the outside, Nolan would notice that. The inside. I'd brought it to a specialist in maritime electronics, a man I'd worked alongside 20 years before fitting navigation systems into cargo ships. He had opened the rear casing and fitted an iridium satellite module no bigger than a thumbnail. The watch now served 2 purposes. It told time and it captured audio. Every 15 minutes it pushed the recording to a secure server via satellite. The battery lasted 120 hours. The module was undetectable unless you already knew it was there. I'd had it installed after a meeting in October, that left me unsettled. A meeting where my son and my CFO had traded a look I couldn't quite decode, and where the figures they put in front of me didn't line up with the reports I'd reviewed the week before. I couldn't say yet what they were building toward, but I had enough to act. I was adjusting the watch's strap when Nolan stepped into the workshop. I hadn't heard him approach. He'd always had that quality quiet on his feet, even as a boy. "Dad," he said from the doorway, "you're up early." I didn't turn around. "Couldn't sleep, figured I'd go through the gear before we head out." He crossed toward me close enough that his cologne reached me first. Expensive. Far too expensive for a vice president's salary, even a comfortable one. "You still carry that antique?" he said, eyeing the watch in my hands. "Your great-grandfather's," I said. "He crossed the Pacific with it." Nolan's expression flickered. "My son never looks hard at old things, not antique watches, not old boats, not a 65-year-old father. He sees age and writes off value. That particular blind spot was going to cost him dearly." "Sentimental stuff," he said. "You ought to get a real GPS watch, something from this century." "This is real enough," I said. He stayed another minute, filling the silence with talk about the weather forecast for Alaska. I kept working, adjusting the satellite module's upload schedule, setting the recording to trigger on voice. Nolan never looked hard. He saw an old man fussing over an old watch and old memories. He never saw what I was constructing around him. After he left, I slipped the watch into my jacket pocket, feeling its weight settle against my ribs. The satellite uplink indicator burned a faint, steady green, active connected battery full. In 3 days, this watch would make its way to an island off the Alaskan coast and capture every word my son said in the dark, and Nolan would have no idea until it was long past too late. I woke in a darkness so total I thought my sight had gone. Then the cold arrived. Not winter cold, the kind that kills. 4 degrees Celsius, perhaps less. My clothes were drenched with salt water freezing against my skin. Sand like ground glass beneath my cheek. I tried to push myself up. The world lurched. My skull felt packed with cotton. My mouth held the taste of metal and chemicals bitter wrong. Wine. I remembered wine. Nolan had poured it on the yacht. 2 glasses of expensive single malt. We'd dropped anchor in a cove off the Alaskan panhandle. He'd said something about celebrating father and son ocean currents, the trip that should have happened 20 years ago. I'd raised the glass, caught something off in the taste, told myself it was a poor vintage. I was wrong about that too. The anesthetic haze broke apart. I got myself upright, every muscle howling from the cold and the stiffness. My hands were numb, my feet were numb. The wind drove straight through my soaked jacket as though I was wearing nothing at all. I scanned around me. Darkness, water waves finding rocks. No yacht lights anywhere. Nothing except stars overhead, sharp and excessive. The way stars present themselves hundreds of miles clear of any city. I went for my phone. Gone. Jacket pockets stripped bare. No emergency beacon, no knife, no lighter. I looked for my pack. Gone. The tent, the sleeping bag, water bottles, food, the marine radio, satellite communicator, maps, all of it gone. Stripped down to the clothes on my back. Then I looked at my wrist. The watch was still there. My grandfather's marine chronometer, the piece Nolan had brushed off as sentimental garbage 3 days earlier in my workshop. He'd left it because he judged it worthless. I pressed the crown. The face glowed faint blue. 2:14 in the morning, June 1st. The satellite uplink showed green. Recording pushing a transmission every 15 minutes to a server my son had no knowledge of. I started to laugh. The sound came out cracked and strange in the frozen air. My son had drugged me, stripped away everything capable of keeping me alive, carried me unconscious to this beach, and left me to die. And in doing so, he left behind the one thing that mattered. But that understanding wouldn't generate heat. I needed to take inventory. 40 years at sea had burned one absolute truth into me. You don't outlast a storm by waiting for rescue. You outlast it by counting what you have, what you need, and how long until the cold wins. What I had, wet clothes, a watch, and 40 years of hard knowledge from running ships through Arctic passages. What I needed, warmth, shelter, fresh water, food. How long until the cold winds, 4-degree water brings on hypothermia and kills in 30 to 90 minutes. I wasn't submerged, but my clothes were saturated. I was 65. The wind wasn't letting up. Maybe 6 hours before my thinking went unreliable. Maybe 12 before I lost the ability to move. Maybe 24 before my heart quit. I looked up and found the North Star through pure muscle memory. 40 years of navigation don't abandon you even when you're dying. Got my bearings. The mainland would lie east, maybe northeast. I stood. My legs trembled but held. I moved toward where the tree line ought to be. Found it. Pine and spruce dense and dark. No path, no lights, no sound apart from wind and water and my own breathing. My son had drugged me. My son had carried me here while I lay unconscious. My son had stripped away everything that might have kept me alive. My son had left me to die on this beach. I expected those words to arrive as rage or grief or something that felt like betrayal. They arrived as cold, simple facts. I moved along the beach with my arms wrapped tight across my chest, working my legs, trying to push heat back into my body. The sand gave way to rocks. The rocks gave way to a cliff face, too sheer to attempt in the dark. I turned and went the other direction. More beach, more rocks. The island was small, extremely small, maybe a quarter-mile across. No lights anywhere out on the water, no engine noise, no rescue coming. Nolan was already gone. Back to Portland. Back to the corporation. Back to whatever scheme required my death to go through. He believed he'd left me with nothing. He thought the old watch on my wrist was a piece of nostalgia and sentiment. He had no idea it was capturing every sound, the waves, the wind, the sound of my breathing. And soon, if I managed to survive long enough, it would capture his voice again. Every word, every confession. But before any of that, I had to get through the night. I found a hollow in the rocks above the tide line, sheltered somewhat from the wind. Stripped off my wet jacket, counterintuitive, but saturated fabric bleeds heat from the body faster than bare skin. Wrung it out with fingers I could barely feel, pulled it back on, curled tight arms around my knees, holding on to whatever warmth I still had left in me. The watch kept ticking on my wrist. In Portland, Nolan was probably stretched out in his expensive apartment, sleeping soundly, rehearsing whatever version of events he'd delivered to the board when I failed to come back. Lost at sea. A tragic accident. His father loved the water, took the yacht out on his own, never returned. He'd grieve convincingly. That was one thing he'd always been good at. I shut my eyes not to sleep. Sleep is how you die in the cold. I closed them to count heartbeats, count breaths, count the minutes until first light when I could actually see what I was dealing with. The watch recorded it all. Silence. Cold. The sound of a man who had decided he wasn't finished. First light broke over the Gulf of Alaska at 4:47 pale gray, bleeding out across black water. I'd been counting for 2 hours and 33 minutes. My hands had gone white. My lips were numb, but I was still conscious, still drawing breath. I rose from the rocks, every joint registering its complaint, and took stock of what my son had left me with. The island was smaller than I'd reckoned, in the dark, maybe 350 yards long, 120 wide. Rocky beach, dense pine forest cliffs along the north side. No structures, no boats, no other human beings. The mainland sat visible to the northeast dark ridgeline against a lighter sky. 5 miles off, maybe 10. Too far to swim. Too far for any signal to reach. I glanced at the watch, still recording, still uploading, still counting down the hours until Nolan discovered the size of his first mistake. At 5:30 in the morning, with the dawn fully opened over the Gulf of Alaska, I got to my feet and started north along the rocky beach. Not in panic, not in despair, in the deliberate pattern of a captain working through a storm assessment. 40 years at sea doesn't abandon you. The temperature was still 4 degrees, maybe 5, now that the sun had crested. My clothes were still damp, my hands still bloodless, but my mind had moved from survival mode into assessment mode. There's a real distinction between the two. Survival mode gets you through the night. Assessment mode gets you off the island. I needed an inventory not of what I'd lost. That list was brief everything. What I needed to catalog was what I still had, what the island itself could yield, and what 4 decades of maritime experience could pull from rock water and pine forest. Survival priority sequence, the same order I drilled into crews on Arctic routes. Shelter, water, food, direction, time. Shelter first. I looked inland. Dense pine started 20 yards from the high tide line, thick enough to cut the wind. Last night I'd huddled in the rocks because I couldn't see the forest. Tonight I'd need something better. Pine boughs could form a lean-to if I could snap enough branches with bare hands. Not comfortable, but breathing. Water second. I moved north along the beach, scanning the tree line for the sign every captain learns in cold climates: moss, growing darker than the rest, clustered on north-facing rock. Found it at 300 yards up the beach, a stream maybe 8 inches wide, carving through the rocks from the inland forest down to the sea. I knelt, cupped my hand, drank. Glacier-fed, cold enough to ache in my teeth clean. No sulfur, no mineral edge, pure runoff from snowmelt higher on the island. I drank until my stomach cramped, then drank more. Dehydration kills faster than hunger. I'd gone 16 hours without water since Nolan drugged me. My body needed this more than warmth. Food. Third. I stood and wiped my mouth and studied the tidal rocks spreading out into the water. Oysters clustered on the exposed rock faces at low tide. Pacific oysters, gray-blue shells, the width of my palm. Further out, tidal pools held crabs, small ones. Dungeness crabs, maybe, but protein. Kelp ran along the waterline. Bull kelp edible if you're far enough gone. I wasn't there yet, but 48 hours would change that. Direction, fourth. I turned and read the sun angle, still low, still climbing east-southeast. That positioned the mainland. I worked through wind patterns current direction from last night's star positions distance from the anchorage where Nolan had put the drug in my glass. Southeast maybe 120 miles. Too far to swim, too far to signal. But knowing the direction meant knowing which way to face if rescue ever came, which it wouldn't. Not from Nolan. Time fifth. The most important calculation of all. I checked the watch. 5:43 in the morning, June 1st. Satellite indicator still showing green uploading every 15 minutes. Battery at 87%. Nolan would have made Portland by early morning. He'd give it 12 hours, maybe fewer, before reporting me missing. Father didn't return from a solo fishing trip search and rescue protocols. Grieving son. The corporate bylaws contained a 48-hour emergency clause. If the CEO was incapacitated or unreachable, the vice president could convene an emergency board meeting on 24 hours' notice. Nolan would declare me missing by tonight, schedule the meeting for June 3rd, perhaps June 4th if he wanted to project the right amount of anguish. 60 to 65 hours at the outside before he stood in that boardroom and took possession of everything I'd built across 40 years. I had to be off this island before that meeting opened. 40 years as a captain teaches you to read water, wind, and sky, how storms accumulate where currents run when ice is building. But the first thing it teaches you is simpler than any of that. Panic drowns you faster than the sea does. I walked back south along the beach cataloging what I'd found. Freshwater stream confirmed. Food sources thin but present. Shelter materials available. Direction to the mainland known and useless without a vessel. Without a boat. That was the hole in every calculation. I could endure on this island for days, weeks possibly, if I was disciplined about it. But endurance wasn't the objective. The objective was reaching Portland before Nolan executed paperwork that couldn't be undone. And for that, I needed off this rock. I came around the northern point and headed back toward the place where I'd regained consciousness. The beach here was different, less rock, more sand, smooth and gray and unmarked except for my own prints from earlier. And something else. I stopped. 20 feet ahead, crossing the sand from the tree line down to the water's edge. Drag marks. Not my footprints, not driftwood. Drag marks, 2 parallel grooves in the sand about 3 feet apart, deep enough to tell me someone had hauled something considerable across this beach. A canoe. I moved closer and crouched. The marks were fresh. The tide hadn't reached them. I could see the high tide line 10 feet below where the marks began. That told me they'd been made after high tide. I put high tide at roughly 6 hours ago based on the current waterline. Someone had dragged a canoe across this beach within the last 12 hours, possibly within the last 6. I traced the marks with my eyes. They ran from the forest toward the water, then curved west in the direction of the rocky promontory where the morning fog still pressed against the stones. Deliberate. Purposeful. One person, the grooves were too clean, too consistent for multiple people wrestling with the weight. Someone strong enough to move a canoe alone. The marks were fresh. The tide hadn't touched them. Someone had been here on this same beach hauling a boat toward the west promontory within the past day, maybe the past 12 hours. I looked toward the promontory. Fog swallowed the rocks, made it impossible to read whether the canoe was still there, whether whoever had dragged it was still there. The question wasn't whether someone else was on this island. The question was whether they'd come to help me survive or to finish what Nolan had started. I stared at those drag marks and held my breath for 3 full seconds because I had seen that canoe before. I'd heard it scraping across rocks in the absolute silence of an Alaska night while my son was wishing me dead. The memory hit like cold water thrown in my face. Midnight, May 31st, bleeding into June. First 12 hours before I came fully conscious on that beach. I'd surfaced too soon. Nolan had miscalculated. The anesthetic dose he'd measured into the wine was calibrated for ordinary metabolism, office workers, desk executives, men who'd spent 40 years in boardrooms rather than on ship decks in Arctic conditions. But 40 years at sea rewires your body, changes the way you process cold exhaustion chemicals. I came to partial consciousness around 11:30 at night. Not fully awake, the drug still had me wrapped in fog, but aware, hearing, thinking slowly through thoughts packed in cotton. I was lying on sand-cold, soaked hands beyond feeling. Voices, male and female, arguing in clipped whispers maybe 50 yards off west toward the rocky promontory. I forced my eyes open. Darkness, stars above. The drug made everything swim and tilt, but I could make out silhouettes against the water. Two figures wrestling with something on the rocks. A canoe snagged on the reef at low tide. I recognized my son's voice even through the anesthetic haze. The second voice took longer to place. Higher, precise, educated. Female. Celinda. Celinda Ferris, 36 years old, Chief Financial Officer of Holt Shipping Corporation. Nolan's wife of 4 years. I had promoted her myself 3 years before. Sharp, ruthless, with numbers exactly right for the CFO role. I thought Nolan had chosen well, someone who understood the business, who could help him grow into leadership. I was wrong about that, too. Push harder, Celinda said, her voice carrying across the water the way sound does over open ocean at night. We need to get this back to the yacht before anyone sees. There's no one here, Nolan said. That's the whole goddamn point. Then push. I should have stayed down, should have kept feigning unconsciousness. But something in me, some stubborn, dying flicker of hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that my son hadn't truly drugged me and left me to perish, made me move. I crawled slowly, elbows and knees. The drug made coordination nearly impossible, but I covered 20 yards from sand to rocks without a sound and settled behind a boulder maybe 30 feet from where they struggled with the canoe. And I listened. How long? Nolan asked. 48 hours until the emergency clause activates, Celinda said. She'd stopped fighting the canoe and was standing on the reef checking her phone. Board meeting June 3rd, 8 a.m. By then he'll be bones on this beach and no one will ever find him. For the search, you declare him missing tomorrow evening. Say he went out fishing alone at dawn and never came back. Coast Guard runs a standard sweep. They won't find a thing. We're 120 miles from the nearest patrol route. Nolan laughed. The sound bounced off the rocks. Old man becomes prey to animals or dies of thirst out here. His outdated maritime thinking is worthless now. The corporation belongs to us. It always should have. There is a particular sound a father's heart makes when he hears his own son wish him dead. It doesn't shatter, it doesn't break, it goes cold and completely silent like a ship's engine cutting out in the middle of open ocean. No warning, just sudden hollow quiet. I reached for my wrist. The watch was still there. Nolan had noticed it on the yacht, dismissed it the same way he'd dismissed it in my workshop. Worthless antique. Sentimental garbage. I pressed the crown twice. The record function engaged with a single small beep, completely swallowed by the sound of the canoe grinding across the reef, and I listened. They talked for 47 minutes, not without interruption. There were pauses while they wrestled with the canoe, long stretches of grunting and cursing and the scrape of aluminum on rock. But when they spoke freely because they believed I was unconscious on a beach dying of hypothermia beyond hearing anything ever again. They discussed the board meeting. Celinda had already drafted the emergency resolution documents. Nolan would play the grieving son to perfection he'd been practicing, he said, in the mirror. They went over the 48-hour clause and the corporate bylaws I had written myself 20 years ago, never imagining my own son would one day use them to strip me of everything. They talked about the corporation's worth $400 to $600 million, depending on asset valuation and how they planned to divide it. Not equally. Celinda wanted the larger share. They argued about that for 6 minutes. They talked about me as though I were already gone, as though I had never been a person, just an obstacle, outdated thinking, a worthless old man who should have retired 10 years ago. And through all of it, the watch recorded. One small button, one tiny beep buried under the sound of aluminum scraping reef rock. In 40 years as captain, I'd made 1,000 life or death calls in seconds. This was the easiest one I ever made. Every 15 minutes, the watch pushed its audio file up to the satellite, forwarding it to secure servers Nolan had no knowledge of. Backup upon backup upon backup, evidence being built in the dark while my son thought he was watching me die. Around 12:45, they finally got the canoe clear. Go, Celinda said. I'll meet you at the yacht. We need to be 20 miles offshore by dawn. Nolan dragged the canoe toward the water, then stopped and looked back toward where I'd been lying on the beach. Think he's dead yet? He asked. Celinda checked her phone for the weather. 4 degrees Celsius, wet clothes, 65 years old. Give him 12 hours, hypothermia, we'll finish it. Good, Nolan said. They put the canoe in the water and paddled away into the dark toward where the yacht rode at anchor offshore. The sound of the aluminum paddle faded until there was nothing left but waves and wind. I held behind the rocks for another 10 minutes, making certain they were gone, making certain the drug wouldn't drag me back under. Then I crawled back to the beach, back to the spot where Nolan had left me, lay down in the sand in the same position, closed my eyes, and waited for dawn. The forgiving father died on those rocks, listening to his son map out his murder. What crawled back to that beach was something else, something cold, something that counted. The flashback broke apart. I was back in the present, in the June morning light, standing over those same canoe drag marks in the sand. The trap had snapped shut around them the moment that canoe snagged the reef, and Nolan started talking. They just hadn't understood that yet. The evidence existed. The trap was already sprung. Nolan just didn't know it. I left the beach and moved inland through the sparse Alaska pine, heading deliberately into the island's interior. Not fleeing what I now knew about my son. Hunting for what I didn't yet know. The forest was thin, none of the dense coastal rainforest you find across most of Alaska, just scrubby pine and spruce clinging to rocky soil. The ground climbed gradually from the shoreline, gaining maybe 40 feet over 200 yards. The cold air carried the smell of sap and moss and something older than both. I moved with care. My body was still recovering, hands clumsy, legs still unreliable, but 40 years of crossing ship decks in heavy weather had taught me how to keep moving when the ground refused to cooperate. 200 yards inland, I found the camp, or what remained of one. A clearing maybe 20 feet across, sheltered by pine on 3 sides. A cold fire pit at the center, ashes long dead, months old at least. Scattered rocks arranged into a windbreak and a torn industrial tarp, blue and yellow, half buried under pine needles. I knelt beside the tarp and pulled it free. The logo was faded, but still legible. Holt Shipping Corporation, Geological Survey Division. My hands stopped moving. I pushed more pine needles aside, found a broken pencil. Yellow paint worn down to bare wood, but the stamp was clear. Property of WSC Geo Survey, the engineer. August 2022. 9 months ago. A young man, 28, fresh geology degree from the University of Washington. Holt Shipping had taken him on for coastal survey work, identifying potential deep-water port sites along the Alaska Panhandle standard expansion research. His name was Curtis Renwick. He'd gone missing in August. His last contact was a satellite phone call saying he was extending his survey by 3 more days. After that, nothing. Search and rescue turned up nothing. The Coast Guard ran a week-long search. I had authorized company resources for a private effort, spent nearly $180,000 looking. No evidence, no body, no gear, just gone. I'd signed off on the report myself, ruled it accident at sea, presumed drowned body, never recovered. Because I'd been searching the wrong ocean. I held that broken pencil in my palm for a long time. Geological Survey Division, 2022, accident at sea. I had signed that report and closed that investigation myself. No evidence, no body ever recovered because from the beginning I had been looking in the wrong ocean entirely. Nolan had killed him here on this island, left him to decompose in the forest or be taken apart by animals. Then Nolan had gone back to Portland, filed the missing person report, played the concerned executive, let the search run its course, let it fail. And 9 months later, Nolan had brought me to the exact same place. Not impulsive, not panicked, not a son pushed to desperate betrayal by greed or fear. Systematic, calculated, practiced. My son was a killer who had done this before. Who had a system, who had a dumping ground. I was victim number 2. I got to my feet slowly. The island felt different now, not just the place Nolan had abandoned me to die. A place Nolan had used. A tool. How many others? Just the engineer and me, or were there more camps I hadn't come across? More pencils stamped with corporate logos? More people who'd grown inconvenient? The cold sitting in my chest had nothing to do with the temperature anymore. I turned back toward the beach. Different path this time, cutting east rather than west. The sun had climbed higher, late morning, maybe noon. I needed food. The oysters on the tidal rocks. The east shore was nothing like where I'd come to on the beach. Cliffs here, not sand, rising maybe 15 feet above the waterline. Tidal rocks at their base pulled bare by the low tide, thick with oysters and mussels and kelp. I picked my way down, carefully found a rock with an edge, started working the oysters loose. The first arrow struck the cliff face 2 centimeters from my left hand. I went still. That was no miss. That was precision. If she'd wanted me dead, I would be dead already. That was a warning. The second arrow hit 2 centimeters from my right hand. Same exactness, a mirror of the first. I looked up. Mara Blackthorne stood 30 feet above me at the tree line along the cliff's edge. 50 years old, maybe beyond that, hard to gauge with a face weathered by years of hard living. Gray hair pulled back tight. Traditional bow-drawn third arrow knocked and aimed at my chest. She wasn't studying my face. She was fixed on my shirt. The Holt Shipping corporate polo I'd had on aboard the yacht faded now, torn, crusted with salt and grime. But the logo on the left chest was still readable. The stylized ship's wheel. The letters WSC. And underneath, too small to make out from 30 feet, but I knew what was there. Founded 1951. Crane. She spoke one word. Not a question, not curiosity either. Recognition. The way you clock a rattlesnake's pattern and know in an instant what it means. The bow didn't move. Mara Blackthorne. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew exactly what I was seeing. 50 years old, a face worn by hard weather eyes that didn't blink, hands that held that bow like it had grown from her body. Traditional design wood and sinew, not compound fiberglass, the kind you build yourself when you live somewhere without stores. She stepped out from the pine shadows with that bow still drawn, nothing in her expression, and the only thing on my entire body that registered to her was that corporate logo still visible on my torn shirt. Crane, she said again. Flat, cold, like a name that had been burned into memory 20 years back and never once let go. In one heartbeat, I understood 3 things. 1, she had been watching me since I woke up on this island, maybe since the yacht dropped anchor. Those canoe marks I'd found weren't old. They were hers. She knew that name. Aldous Crane, my wife's father. Nolan's grandfather, the man who founded Holt Shipping 70 years ago and turned it into an empire by doing things nobody asked questions about. 3, whatever Aldous Crane had done to this woman or her people, it was severe enough that seeing his name across my chest made her pull a bow and train it on my heart. I had maybe 10 seconds to become something other than what that logo declared me to be. Or the third arrow would follow the first 2. I didn't wait for permission. I started speaking the instant my brain reconnected to my mouth because hesitating meant the third arrow, and I had exactly one truth that might keep me alive. My name is Warren Holt, I said. My voice came out wrecked from cold and salt water. Crane Holt was my father-in-law. He's dead now, died in 2017. I know what that name means to you. I know what happened in 2003. The bow didn't waver, but she didn't loose the arrow either. I moved with care, raised my left hand. The one farther from the oyster knife I'd been using, showed her my open palm, then brought it across to my right hand and worked at the ring. Family ring gold, worn smooth by 40 years on my finger, engraved on the inside with dates I no longer needed to read. I had them memorized. My wedding date. The day my son came into the world. The day I became CEO. I pulled it off. First time in 40 years. The skin beneath was pale and strange-looking. I set the ring on the rock in front of me. Not as an offer, not a bribe, just acknowledgement. This is who I am. This is what I'm bound to. This is what I'm willing to put down in order to speak truth to you. Spring 2003, I said. Oil spill in your tribe's fishing waters. One of our vessels struck a reef in a storm, leaked 11,000 gallons of bunker fuel before we could bring it under control. Emergency board meeting, 48 hours later, 9 directors. I could still see that room. Mahogany table, leather chairs, my father-in-law, Aldous Crane, at the head of the table, 78 years old and still commanding every space he walked into. 8 directors voted to manage it quietly. I voted no. I said only dissent, 9-1. I paused. Let that land. Then I testified in federal court against Crane Holt, against my own father-in-law, against the entire board. I told the EPA exactly what took place in that meeting, what the vote was, what we knew about the spill and when we knew it, what the board had decided to bury. I testified against my own father-in-law in federal court, Crane Holt, the empire's founder, the man who'd handed me my first ship to captain 20 years before. I stood in that courtroom and told the EPA precisely what the board had voted to conceal. It cost me 2 years for that testimony. I thought I'd lose everything. Crane pulled me from the board, kept me on as captain punishment. He needed my maritime experience. Couldn't cut me loose without conceding that what I'd testified to was true, but I was stripped of every corporate role. Told the family I'd turned on them. The EPA investigation went ahead. Federal fines, environmental remediation costs, and compensation to your tribe for the fishing grounds that were destroyed, I went on. Total cost to Holt Shipping, $60 million over 5 years. I looked up at her. The bow was still drawn, but something had shifted in her face. Not trust, attention. She was listening. Nolan was 8 years old in 2003, I said. He grew up with that story. Grew up hearing his grandfather Crane say I'd cost the family $60 million. Hearing the board members who'd backed the cover-up say I'd betrayed the Holt legacy. Hearing his mother, my wife, say I'd chosen strangers over my own blood. My throat was raw, but I pushed on. Nolan made a decision, I said. When he got old enough to understand what happened, he chose his grandfather's version of events. Chose to read 2003 as betrayal rather than what I believed it was doing what was right when it cost everything. I gestured at the island around me. He chose this island deliberately, I said. Not by chance. Not just a convenient place to dump me. This is tribal land protected waters. The same waters where the 2003 spill occurred. Where your people lost their fishing grounds for 5 years. Nolan knows every detail of 2003. Every vote. Every word I spoke in that courtroom. Every dollar the family surrendered in fines and tribal compensation. $60 million total. That's why I'm on this island in your tribal waters. He wants me to die on the exact land I fought to protect. The ultimate revenge. My son drugged me, I said. Brought me out here unconscious, stripped away everything that could help me survive, and left me to die of hypothermia on this beach. He knew what he was doing, and this wasn't the first time I found another man's camp inland. Holt Shipping geological survey gear. The engineer who went missing last year, Nolan killed him here too. I stopped. Let the waves fill the quiet for 3 heartbeats. But Nolan made a mistake, I said. He thought leaving me here to die was justice symmetry. The father who saved tribal lands dies on tribal lands where no one will ever find him. But he didn't know you were here, didn't know the ground he picked for my grave already had a witness. I looked directly at Mara. I don't know your name, I said. I don't know your story. I don't know what Crane Holt's company took from you or your family beyond the oil spill. But I know that name makes you want to put an arrow through me, and I know I have one truth that might be worth letting me live. I gestured toward the ring on the rock. I gave up 2 years on that board for testifying in 2003, I said. Lost my wife's respect, lost my father-in-law's trust, lost the easy road where I could have voted yes and kept everything comfortable, and 20 years on my own son is trying to kill me partly because of that choice. I stopped talking, my voice was gone. Salt and cold and exhaustion had taken the rest of it. Every sound drained off the cliff face, just the percussion of surf on stone and pine boughs working in the wind above. Mara held her gaze on the ring. A full minute passed, then another. The bow remained taut, the arrow's tip tracking my sternum. When she finally spoke, the tone hadn't shifted a degree. Why not sell it, she said. Money purchases more than honor ever could. I studied her expression. Price had nothing to do with it. She was measuring me. I had maybe 5 seconds to figure out the real question underneath the spoken one. Staring at that family ring sitting on the rock between us, I worked it out. She wasn't asking why I held on to it. She was asking what it had cost me to keep it. That ring is the only proof I have that I paid for the choice I made in 2003, I told her. Crane handed it to me the day I married his daughter. Gold family crest. Every ounce of Holt legacy compressed into a single band of metal. It stays on my finger because it makes me remember the price of choosing right over rich. Silence. Surf. Wind. Then Mara let the bow drop not all the way down, just enough to shift the arrow off my heart and onto the rocks beneath my boots. Follow, she said. She turned and headed up the cliff path without a backward glance. No check to see if I moved. Nothing. Mara, she said, once still climbing, face still turned away. Her own name, nothing more. On this island that apparently passed for an introduction. I retrieved the ring from the rock and worked it back onto my finger. The metal had gone cold, and after 10 minutes off my hand, the fit felt wrong in a way I noticed. I went after her. 15 minutes of walking through pine forest near dark the whole way. The sun had slipped below the horizon while I'd been talking. Twilight was bleeding out fast into Alaska summer night. Mara navigated the trees as though every root, every stone was memorized. I went down twice on ground I simply couldn't read. She didn't break stride. The cave entrance was masked behind a downed spruce, invisible until you were practically on top of it. Natural rock mouth, maybe 8 feet tall, pulling inward to a corridor that bored into the island's core. Mara ducked through struck flint, caught fire. Inside, the space opened up far beyond what the entrance promised, maybe 15 feet across, headroom enough to stand upright. Permanent habitation, everything ordered, everything tended. Furs laid over flat stones for a bed, clay pots for water, dried fish strung on a rope stretched between columns of natural stone. Herb bundles knotted and suspended near the fire pit, positioned so the smoke would do the preserving work. She hadn't arrived here recently. Mara pointed me toward a fur beside the fire, and I went down onto it, or rather my legs decided for me, folding halfway through the motion. Exhaustion anesthetic still working through my system, the residual damage from the hypothermia, all of it landed simultaneously. She worked without hesitation. Drew water from a large storage jar into a clay vessel, then ground dried leaves between her palms. 3 plants I'd never encountered, and added them to the water. Set it at the fire's edge to heat. While it came up to temperature, she speared oysters onto a green stick and rotated them over the flames. The scent hit me somewhere primal. More than 24 hours without food. 5 minutes later, she put the vessel in my hands. Dark liquid, steam rising off it. "Drink," she said. "Anesthetic still in your blood. This cleanses." I drank. It tasted like scorched cedar crossed with something I had no word for, knowledge carried forward through generations of practice. The kind of knowledge men like Crane Holt never bothered acquiring while they were erecting empires out of paperwork and calling that civilization. I swallowed every bitter mouthful because when your life is the steak, flavor doesn't factor in. The oysters followed, grilled to the edge of burning hot enough to raise a welt on my tongue. 6 of them, and my hands finally steadied. Mara sat opposite the fire and watched me the entire time. Didn't touch food herself, just observed the way you'd monitor an experiment you weren't sure would resolve. As the heat from the meal and the tea pushed back through my core, the trembling wound down. Clarity returned. It was the first moment since coming to on that beach where I felt something resembling human. "How long have you been on this island?" I asked. She let the question sit for a moment, fed a piece of driftwood to the fire. Sparks climbed. 7 years, she said at last. Year-round. Kayak to mainland twice per year for supplies I can't make or hunt. What? Not your question to ask. Fair enough. 10 minutes of quiet between us. The fire talked. Wind threaded through the cave mouth. An owl, somewhere outside in the dark. Then Mara started speaking again. "Your son dispatched someone to assess this island 8 months ago," she said. "Mineral resources, geological assessment. I saw him. The engineer you found." My hands went still over the fire. "I didn't save him," she went on. "The same flat register as before. No apology. No explanation offered. I observed him make camp. 3 days of watching him work. Watched your son's yacht come in. Watched the confrontation. Watched Nolan bring a rock down on him when the engineer said he intended to file a report on what he'd uncovered. Deposit significant enough to justify industrial mining, enough to gut this island entirely." She held my gaze. "I didn't save him because at that point I had no idea who he was, didn't know what he'd found, didn't know whose man he was. Just one more Holt Shipping employee on ground that Holt Shipping had already torn up before. I let him die. No softening, no plea for understanding. She laid it out the way you state a fact, the way someone speaks who paid dearly once for extending trust to the wrong person. I understood it. Some alliances don't come from warmth, they come from shared necessity. Those are the ones that actually hold. "Now I have your full picture," Mara said. "Holt, who stood up in court against Crane. Holt, who surrendered 2 years of his life for testifying to the truth in federal proceedings. Holt, whose own son wants him dead urgently enough to lead him to the same island where he's already killed." She let that settle. "Common enemy," she said. Statement, not question. "Yes," I said. "How much time before your son seizes the company?" I glanced at my watch. Satellite indicator still green. Satellite. Still recording. Still transmitting. 52 hours, I said. June 4th, 8 a.m., emergency board meeting. If I'm absent, he takes the CEO chair and everything that goes with it. Mara gave a single nod, added another piece of wood to the fire. "But 52 hours from this island to the Portland mainland," she said. "Not enough time for conventional sailing routes. Not enough for a distress signal and a Coast Guard extraction. Not enough to construct a proper vessel." She studied me through the flames. "But enough to begin," I said. "Enough to begin," she said back. Silence settled over us again. The fire worked. Wind drove through the cave entrance. Out in the black water, the ocean continued its indifferent labor. Currents and tides and patterns I'd spent 40 years charting in my head, but tomorrow I'd be reading them through entirely different eyes. The eyes of Mara's people who had understood these waters for 200 years before Holt Shipping drew its first line on a map. Mara rose from her place by the fire and indicated the sleeping furs. "Rest," she said. "We build tomorrow." I stretched out on hides that carried the smell of wood smoke, brine, and endurance. The watch kept its count against my wrist. 52 hours, enough to start. Possibly enough to see it through. The fire crackled on and I shut my eyes the first time I'd allowed that since I'd come awake on a frozen beach. Warm at last, steady at last, alongside someone whose understanding of trust matched mine, exactly earned through need, verified through pressure. We'd assemble the raft at first light, for now I'd sleep. And over in Portland, my son lay in bed convinced he'd already won. At first light on June 2nd, Mara was positioned at the western shoreline, tracing water patterns with her hand that 4 decades at sea had never taught me to see. "Don't watch the surface, watch what's underneath it," she said. 6 hours of sleep in the cave, then cold oysters and another round of that bitter tea for breakfast. My body still carried the damage hypothermia anesthetic, but the fog had lifted from my mind. 50 hours to Nolan's board meeting. 1 day to construct what we'd need. Mara walked me back through the pine forest to the island's western face. Nothing like the rock shelf where I'd regained consciousness. Sand here, not boulders. A long, gentle pitch into the water rather than a sheer drop. Sunrise was beginning to crack the sky behind the island's ridge, stretching shadows long across the beach. She directed my attention to a patch of water 15 yards out. "The pattern don't look at the top," she said. "Look below. Current down there runs southeast toward the mainland, reverses every 12 hours on the tide." I looked. The surface was doing what Alaska coastal water always does. Incoming waves, seafoam kelp, riding the chop. Nothing remarkable. "I don't see it," I said. "You're reading the wrong layer," she said. "Drop your eye 6 feet below the surface. Watch what the kelp does down there versus up here." I concentrated, and then it was there, faint but undeniable. The kelp at the surface swept northeast on the visible current. The deeper kelp barely distinguishable through the column of water angled southeast. A different heading entirely. 2 currents stacked on one another. "This channel," I said carefully. "Nothing in 40 years of charts ever showed me this." "Your charts have limits," Mara said. "My grandmother's grandmother read this water before my grandmother was born, and she passed that reading down. My grandmother gave it to me. 200 years of accumulated knowledge while your people scratched lines on paper and declared the ocean known." She wasn't wrong. 40 years of command had sharpened my ability to read instruments, satellite feeds, current tables, GPS overlays, precision engineered to the meter. But Mara was handing me something no maritime academy had ever put in a curriculum: knowledge carried from grandmother to granddaughter across 2 centuries, while men like me scratched lines on charts and believed we'd mastered the water. "Light raft," Mara said. "Driftwood bamboo outrigger for stability. Get the balance right. The current handles the rest. 14 to 16 hours to reach the mainland." "What's the tidal window?" I asked. "Opens at 4 a.m. tomorrow," she said. "June 3rd. Closes by 8. Miss it and the next one comes 16 hours later. That puts you past your deadline. Tomorrow morning at 4:30, 2 hours from now." Mara turned and moved up the beach toward a pile of driftwood stacked against the tree line. Storm wreckage, salt-weathered but lean and solid where it counted. She began pulling pieces out and evaluating them. I worked beside her. We moved without talking, lifting and testing each piece, setting aside anything too waterlogged or too far gone. By the time the sun had climbed fully above the horizon, we had 20 pieces arranged on the sand. "Frame first," Mara said. She walked me through the construction logic. 2 long base runners, 8 feet apiece, cross braces at 2-foot intervals. Bamboo outrigger on the port side, 3 feet off the main hull, lashed to it with long cross poles. No fasteners, no cordage, only vine. Mara demonstrated the spiral binding. The vine she'd cut the previous day and left soaking overnight in salt water, more supple that way. Wrap over the joint, under, around, back, through, over. A spiral pattern, precise tension at every stage. Over. Under tension here, she said, fingers moving without hesitation. Wet vine contracts, stronger than rope, and it won't split the grain the way a nail does. I watched closely, then attempted the next joint on my own. Too slack. Mara unwrapped it, walked me through it again. 3rd try was better. 5th was passable. By the 10th joint, I'd found the rhythm. 6 hours of construction followed. She tied. I positioned. She corrected tension. I calculated load distribution and where the center of gravity needed to sit. 4 decades of shipbuilding logic applied to 8 feet of weathered driftwood and bamboo lashing. Will this vine tension hold in 2-meter swells, I asked at one point. It has for 200 years, Mara said. Good enough, I said. Later, working on the outrigger balance, I said needs another foot of total width to account for my weight. Mara nodded and adjusted without a word. That's how we built it in near silence. No personal histories traded, no effort to turn the work into friendship. Just 2 sets of hands, competence meeting competence. 2 people who'd both learned that trust gets built through doing, not talking. By mid-afternoon, I'd put more faith in Mara's vine joints than in any weld I'd inspected across 4 decades at sea. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the raft was finished. 9 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3-foot bamboo outrigger on the port side. Total weight maybe 85 pounds, light enough for 2 people to shoulder, strong enough to carry 1 man across open ocean. We dragged it to the waterline and pushed it in. I stepped aboard, distributed my weight deliberately, felt the way it answered the water. The outrigger held the balance. The vine joints didn't give. The driftwood frame flexed with incoming waves but held its shape. I stepped back off. We hauled it above the tide line and secured it to a tree trunk. Ready for 4 a.m., 30 hours from now. I turned to Mara. She stood next to the raft, same unreadable expression she'd worn since the cliff. Have you made this crossing before, I asked? She considered me for 3 seconds. Once she said, and the outcome, her face gave nothing. I'm standing here. That was the entirety of my guarantee. 1 crossing, 1 woman, 1 survival, a single data point. I nodded. It's enough, I said. We walked back toward the cave as the sun began its descent toward the western water. At 4 a.m. tomorrow, I'd step onto that driftwood raft and stake my life on 200 years of passed-down knowledge to carry me across 120 miles of Alaska Gulf. But tonight, while I slept in that cave preparing for a dawn departure rooted in indigenous skill and sheer calculated desperation 120 miles south in Portland, my son was pushing his takeover forward. And the woman who'd helped him engineer my death was about to learn she'd never been a partner in any of it. Just an instrument with a built-in shelf life. 1 data point. 1 survival. It had to be enough. But while Mara and I lashed driftwood with vine on June 2nd, I had no idea what was already in motion back in Portland. Nolan had convened an emergency board meeting at 6 that morning, a grief performance precise enough to capture 6 votes out of 9. By the time we were testing the outrigger and declaring the raft complete, he'd secured temporary CEO authority effective the following morning. 1 signature from everything I'd spent 40 years constructing. What he couldn't see was that the woman seated beside him in that boardroom, the one who'd helped him engineer my death to the degree, had just found out she was next. By noon, Celinda's allegiance had become something else entirely. She laid it all out for FBI investigators 3 days afterwards, seated in an interview room recounting every detail in that controlled professional voice she never seemed to lose. Noon on June 2nd, their downtown apartment, Nolan in meetings with transition attorneys. He'd left his laptop at home unlocked, something he never did. Celinda needed quarterly projections. She opened the laptop, found the folder, screenshots, dozens of them, her own text messages from March and April. The affair she believed was buried, every exchange cataloged, below those divorce attorney correspondence, draft papers, asset division laid out in columns. Full custody of Cole awarded to Nolan grounds cited as adultery and corporate espionage. Signing date, May 12, 2023, 3 weeks before Alaska. Celinda sat on the apartment floor for 40 minutes. She told FBI investigators later that she spent that time not mourning the marriage, not weighing the guilt of leaving me on an island to die calculating whether Nolan's plan for her was frame and discard or something more permanent. She concluded she couldn't afford to wait and see. She stood up, called her personal attorney, first got a name. FBI Special Agent Brixton Calder, 42, had been building a file on Holt Shipping's financial irregularities for 3 months. She called Calder at 12:47 p.m. I have information concerning corporate fraud and an attempted murder at Holt Shipping Corporation, she said. Measured, contained. My name is Celinda Ferris. I'm the CFO. I can provide the island coordinates where they left him. Calder asked 3 questions, got 3 answers. Then is Warren Holt still alive? I don't know, Celinda said. And it was the honest answer. But if he's alive, he'll find his own way back. Calder ended the call at 12:51 p.m. and turned to his partner. Get Coast Guard onto those coordinates. If Warren Holt comes off that island breathing, I want federal agents at the dock when he arrives. The case file that would eventually put Nolan away for life without the possibility of parole began taking shape that same afternoon. Island coordinates from Celinda. Anesthetic purchase records trace back to a veterinary supplier in Salem charged to Celinda's corporate card. $4 million in embezzled funds routed through offshore accounts during the window when I was supposedly somewhere on that Alaska trip. A detailed conspiracy timeline, documentary evidence, testimony from a wife who'd chosen her own survival over her loyalty to a man who'd already scheduled her disposal. The walls were closing around Nolan from two sides at once. From the island where I was knotting vine around driftwood with a woman who knew water routes his navigators had never charted. From Portland, where his own wife had just handed federal investigators everything they required. Nolan had no idea about either. He wouldn't until it was past the point of mattering. But as the sun went down on June 2nd and I sat in that cave waiting on a 4 a.m. departure, federal agents were already in motion. Coast Guard vessels were being turned toward coordinates Nolan was certain no one would ever locate. And in 11 hours, I'd push off from shore on a raft held together by vine and 2 centuries of inherited knowledge, and I'd let the ocean decide. The trap was drawing shut from both directions, the island and Portland. But I wouldn't learn about Celinda's call to the FBI or the Coast Guard response for another 12 hours. Night fell on June 2nd. For the first time in 48 hours, I had nothing left to do. The raft was built. The plan was fixed. Departure sat 6 hours out at 4 a.m., which made this the most dangerous stretch of all because thinking is harder than surviving. Mara and I sat in the cave. The fire burned itself down. Outside, the raft held its position above the waterline rope to tree waiting. Everything was in order, which left me 6 hours of nothing but stillness and whatever my mind chose to do with it. Think about Nolan. Think about the board meeting 32 hours away. Think about my wife Vivian, 3 years gone now, who would have despised every decision I'd made since the oil spill testimony. Think about stepping onto a driftwood raft before sunrise and trusting 200 years of grandmother knowledge to carry me across open water. Mara broke the silence first. "What will you do with the corporation when you return?" she asked. I looked at her over the low fire. This wasn't idle curiosity. She needed to know whether pulling me off that island meant pulling back something that would come around and tear this place apart. "I won't do anything with it," I said. Placed it in trust 6 months ago. January of this year. 80 million in personal assets, real estate accounts, investments, every bit of it moved into an irrevocable trust. "For your son, for my grandson," I say. Cole, 4 years old, can't touch a dollar of it until he's 25. The trustee is an independent attorney named Petra Wynn. Not family, not connected to the company, someone Nolan and the board have no leverage over. I pause. Add another piece of driftwood to the fire. That child deserves a different set of options than his father chose, different from the ones I was handed. Money without the weight of expectation crushing him before he's figured out who he is. Time to become something before he has to decide what to do with an empire. His father gets nothing. Not 1 cent from me. The corporate shares are ring-fenced separately. I say shareholder agreements right of first refusal provisions, even holding temporary CEO authority. Nolan can't sell, transfer, or liquidate without a board supermajority. He'll never get there, especially not once I walk back through that door breathing. Mara nodded slowly, taking it in. Before I tell you what she asked next, if you're still with me and you have assets with people in your life pressing on them in ways that don't feel right, trust that instinct. Find a lawyer, sit down and tell them everything. Note what follows has adapted details for storytelling purposes, but the underlying lesson is real. "What about this island?" Mara asked. The question settled on me heavier than I anticipated. "What about it?" "Your son sent surveyors here," she said, 8 months ago before the engineer you found. Mineral assessment. Lithium deposits beneath the East Bay, high-grade enough value to justify industrial mining operations. Something cold moved through my chest. "If you don't come back..." Mara continued, voice flat and without inflection. "Nolan executes the mining contract within 6 months. I've seen the preliminary documentation left behind after the engineer was killed. This island becomes an open pit within 2 years. The water, the fish, the land, all of it erased." She held my gaze. "This island is the last ground my tribe still holds," she said. "Everything else was taken, sold off, submerged, contaminated by companies like yours. This is what's left. If you reclaim your corporation and do nothing, your victory is the instrument of my people losing the last piece of land we have." That question pressed harder than any board vote I'd ever sat through, heavier than any contract across 40 years of business. because Mara wasn't reaching for promises. She was asking whether I understood that winning required more than recovering what was mine. Silence. The fire. The wind working at the cave mouth. I turned back to the 2003 oil spill testimony. The decision that stripped me of 2 years on the board. The decision Nolan has despised me for ever since. The decision I'd make again without hesitation. I'll handle that before I set foot in the meeting room, I said. Mara looked at me across the fire for 10 seconds. How legal protection, I said. Conservation easement transfer ownership to an indigenous land trust. Federal protection under the Native American Graves Protection Act. Make it impossible for anyone, including me, including Nolan, including any CEO who comes after to extract anything from this land, ever. Can you accomplish that in a single day? I can make one call from the Coast Guard vessel, I said. Petra Wynn, the trustee. She'll have the paperwork filed before I reach that boardroom. It'll be done. Mara gave one nod. No smile, no handshake, no expression of gratitude, just one nod. Some commitments get sealed with contracts, notaries, attorneys, and glass towers. Others get made in silence in a cave between two people who've each already paid more than enough for other people's greed. The second kind tends to outlast the first. 4 a.m., Mara said. Tide window opens. I'll be ready, I said. She rose, set one more piece of wood on the fire, and crossed to her sleeping furs on the far side of the cave. I stretched out on my own. The fire worked steadily. Waves broke against the shore in an even rhythm. The watch on my wrist kept ticking, battery at 73%, satellite uplink indicator still green. Still recording. Still pushing everything up to servers Nolan has no knowledge of. 6 hours until departure. 14 to 16 hours on that driftwood raft. Then Portland. Then the boardroom. Then Nolan's face when I walk through that door alive. But tonight, lying in this cave, I don't dwell on revenge. I don't run through the board meeting or the corporation or even my son. I think about an island whose name I never learned. I think about protecting ground for a tribe I stood up for once 20 years back with an oil spill testimony that cost me everything I had at the time. I think about debts that carry more weight than empires. And I fall asleep 6 hours before climbing onto a raft that could easily kill me, thinking that some promises matter more than the odds of surviving them. I slept that night turning over promises and islands and debts that outlast empires. But 300 meters to the south, Celinda sat alone in a dim Portland cafe and made a call to the FBI. I pieced this together afterward from case files, Celinda's testimony, and surveillance logs compiled across the following 72 hours. This is what happened while I slept. Evening, June 2nd, 8:30 p.m., a small cafe in the Pearl District. Rear booths, the kind where conversations don't travel. Celinda arrived first, ordered coffee she wasn't going to drink, positioned herself facing the entrance. FBI Special Agent Brixton Calder came through the door at 8:40. 15 years with the Bureau, 3 months into a financial crimes investigation on Holt Shipping that kept stalling until Celinda's call broke it open. He took the seat across from her. No recorder visible that would come later. This was still assessment. You said you have information about an attempted murder, Calder said. I have coordinates, Celinda said. Same controlled professional register she never seemed to drop. He's on an island off the Alaska Panhandle, and he's not there by choice. She slid a piece of paper across the table. Handwritten. 57.2 degrees north, 135.4 degrees west. GPS coordinates, she said. Accurate to the decimal. Nolan had the yacht's navigation system calculate the precise location before we left him there. Calder didn't reach for the paper. How do you know this wasn't his choice? Because I watched Nolan drug him, Celinda said. Wine on the yacht. Anesthetic. Warren was unconscious within 20 minutes. We anchored offshore, used a canoe to get him to the beach. Stripped him of everything. Tent, food, water, radio beacon, and left him with his clothes and an old watch Nolan figured was worthless. Calder's pen was moving. The anesthetic ware from veterinary supplier in Salem, Celinda said. Nolan used my corporate credit card, forged my authorization signature. I had no knowledge of it until I found the receipt this afternoon. Calder's pen went still midline when she named the veterinary supplier the first hard link between medical-grade sedation and the corporate structure. He looked up. Why come forward now? You were part of this. You could face charges. Because Nolan is going to kill me next, Celinda said. Flat, factual, no performance in it. Found divorce papers on his laptop today, dated 3 weeks before Alaska. Screenshots of my messages, adultery, documented crimes attributed to me alone. He's been constructing my frame since March while I believed we were operating as partners. She lifted her cold coffee, took a sip. If I testify, I need protection, she said. Nolan doesn't leave loose ends standing. And I'm a loose end. Calder studied her across the table. What else can you bring us? 4 million in embezzled funds, Celinda said, routed through offshore accounts during the period Warren was stranded on that island. Wire transfer timestamps, account numbers, routing codes. Nolan believed I was helping him conceal it. I was logging every transaction. She drew a thumb drive from her bag and placed it between them. It's all on there, she said. Coordinates, the anesthetic receipt, the embezzlement trail, the full timeline, Nolan's own communications laying out the plan. Calder picked up the drive. If Warren Holt is alive, he's going to need medical attention when he surfaces. I'm contacting Coast Guard tonight. Do it, Celinda said. But understand, if Warren comes back alive, I'm the prosecution's primary witness. If he doesn't, I'm an accessory to murder. Either path, I'm choosing my own survival. Calder left at 9:15 with enough material to build a case measured in life sentences. Celinda stayed in that booth another 20 minutes, then drove back to the apartment she shared with Nolan and prepared to behave as though nothing had shifted. But Nolan already felt it. Late night, June 2nd, 11:30 p.m., 40th floor offices. Nolan sat alone in what was technically his now my office, the one he'd occupied for all of 18 hours since that morning's emergency vote. The Portland skyline pressed dark against the windows beyond him. Celinda had been off at dinner. Distant, answering questions but never quite meeting his eyes. Said she was exhausted. Said the stress of my disappearance was wearing on her. But Nolan understood performance. He'd built a career on it. He picked up his phone and called the corporate attorney. Woke him up. Move the board meeting, Nolan said. 8 a.m. tomorrow sharp. The lawyer's voice came back thick with sleep. We set it for June 3rd. That gives everyone enough time to— I don't care, Nolan cut in. Push it to June 4th, 8 a.m. Reach everyone. I don't care if Hector is flying in from Boston. Tell him to charter a red-eye. 8 a.m. June 4th. Emergency CEO confirmation. Nolan. What's happened? The longer we let this sit, the more room there is for complications, Nolan said, meaning me. The remote possibility I was still alive somewhere and capable of finding my way back. But underneath that was something he felt more than calculated. Celinda's distance at dinner, the way her eyes had moved over him, measuring something. Speed was the one advantage he still controlled. Lock down the CEO vote. Get the papers signed. Make it legally irreversible before anyone could raise a question. The attorney agreed, said he'd make the calls. Nolan hung up at 11:53. His hand stayed over the phone after the call ended, Portland's skyline dark beyond the glass. He could feel control beginning to slide, though he couldn't yet name the reason. He sat there another hour by himself, turning over timeline acceleration, thinking about his father, 400 miles north, probably dead from exposure, thinking about how close he was to seizing everything. What he didn't know, FBI Special Agent Brixton Calder was already assembling the arrest warrant. What he didn't know, Celinda had flipped to witness with enough material for 3 federal charges. What he didn't know, Coast Guard vessels were already being turned toward coordinates 57.2 degrees north, 135.4 degrees west. And what he absolutely didn't know, I was asleep in a cave on that island, alive, set to push off at dawn on a driftwood raft that would put me in Portland with hours remaining. By midnight on June 2nd, 2 countdowns were running toward the same moment from opposite ends of the law. I lay on fur pelts 400 miles north with no idea that in 36 hours my son would face the board and federal agents would be staged and ready. The race had started. The race had started at midnight, but that wasn't something I knew yet. 4 hours before sunrise, I was hauling the raft through darkness toward waves I couldn't see. Mara walked alongside me, quiet as always. We'd risen at 3:30, no alarm bodies, long conditioned to waking before the light. She'd handed me dried fish and water. I ate standing, watching fog roll in through the cave mouth from the west. Perfect conditions for departure. The fog would keep me invisible from any Coast Guard sweep that might already be running. And if Nolan had sent someone back to confirm I was gone, the fog would conceal me from them too. We hauled the raft between us, 85 pounds of driftwood, bamboo, and vine, manageable in weight but ungainly across rock and pre-dawn blackness. My hands were still short of full recovery from the hypothermia damage. Mara's grip didn't waver. The West Shore beach was invisible until we were standing on it. Fog dense enough that I could barely make out Mara 3 feet away. Waves somewhere ahead of us in the dark, the smell of salt and kelp and cold, open water. We set the raft down at the tide line. The water was drawing out perfect alignment with the southeast current Mara had mapped for me, 4:15 in the morning, exactly the window she'd marked. I stood for a moment looking at what we'd built. Driftwood lashed together with saltwater vine bamboo, outrigger, no motor, no sail, just timber and current, and 200 years of knowledge passed grandmother to granddaughter. And I understood I'd never asked the question that should have come first. "How long have you known I was here?" I asked. Mara didn't pause. "Since the yacht anchored offshore the first night. I watched them bring you ashore." I turned toward her. Her face was barely there in the fog and dark. "You saw Nolan drug me. Saw them leave me on the beach." "Yes," she said. Simple factual. "Why didn't you step in sooner?" I asked. She held the question a moment, then because I trusted the Crane family once. "This time I had to know who you were before I decided anything." That landed harder than I expected. Not anger, not a sense of betrayal, something else entirely. "You let me suffer through 2 days to test whether I was worth pulling out," I said. Mara nodded. "I observed how you moved, how you took stock of what was around you, whether you fell apart or started calculating, whether you tried to take what you found or showed it respect. I needed to know if you were Crane's heir or something else." She paused. "The camp you found," she continued, "last year's engineer. I watched him too for 3 days, concluded he was another corporate instrument sent here to strip the land. I let your son kill him because I didn't yet know what he'd uncovered or who'd dispatched him. I was wrong about that." Her voice held steady. No apology, no shift in register, just a plain account. "But you," she said, "I watched you find that camp. Watched what crossed your face when you understood what had happened there. Watched you connect the engineer's death to your own position. You weren't surprised your son had killed before. You were working out how to survive long enough to prevent him from doing it again." That answer didn't unsettle me. It made me respect her more. 2 days of testing, I said. 2 days to determine whether pulling you out would put another Crane back on this land to finish destroying it, Mara said. Or whether you were genuinely different. The 2003 testimony pointed toward different. But what people say is easy. What they do is what counts. We stood without speaking, fog curling around us, the tide pulling at the raft. "Did I pass?" I asked. Mara looked at the raft, at the supplies she'd helped me pack, at the knife she'd given me from her own kit. "You're leaving on a raft I helped you build," she said. "That's your answer." I nodded. "Fair enough." We walked the raft down to the water's edge. The tide was moving strong. I could register the pull even from the shore. Southeast, toward the mainland, toward Portland, toward Nolan. I stepped aboard with care. The raft shifted but held its trim. The outrigger did exactly what it was supposed to. I settled into position, weight-centered paddle in hand. Mara stood in the shallows with one hand resting on the raft's side. "Current will take you southeast for the first hour," she said. "Don't work against it. Let it carry you. Around hour 3, start angling east. By hour 8, the mainland should be visible. The last 6 hours are the hardest you'll be spent, and that's precisely when the paddling has to be strongest." "Understood," I said. 14 to 16 hours total," she went on. "If you're not ashore by 8 tonight, you've missed the window, and the current will push you north into open ocean. Don't miss it." "I won't," I said. She held my gaze one final time. Her face was weathered and gave nothing away. 50 years of surviving alone on this island, trusting no one after being burned too many times by people in corporate clothes carrying promises they had no intention of keeping. "Thank you, Mara," I said, "for all of it." One nod. "Just get there alive." Then she drove the raft hard off the beach and out into black water. The current grabbed me at once, pulled me from shore, pushed me southeast into fog so thick I couldn't make out my own hands on the paddle. I looked back once. Saw Mara standing in the surf, already dissolving into gray. Then the fog took her completely. The island swallowed itself in gray within heartbeats as though it had never been there. Mara, the cave, the beach, the tree line, all of it. 5 days erased by fog and current and distance. Just black water, an invisible current, the sound of the paddle entering the ocean, the smell of salt, and 14 hours of work ahead. I checked the watch. 4:23 in the morning, June 3rd. 30 hours and 37 minutes until Nolan's board meeting on June 4th at 8 a.m. Enough time. If the raft held. If the current ran true. If I made it. What I didn't know, FBI Special Agent Brixton Calder was already airborne to Portland with an arrest warrant. What I didn't know, Celinda, was in witness protection, getting her testimony in order. What I didn't know, Coast Guard vessels were searching coordinates I'd already departed. What I didn't know, Nolan was awake in Portland preparing for a board meeting that would not unfold the way he'd drawn it up. Two timelines converging on a single moment, June 4th, 8 a.m. One crossing the ocean, one moving through federal law, both pointed at the same target. I paddled into fog and darkness alone for the first time in 5 days, heading back toward a son who was certain I was already dead. The island had vanished. I paddled into darkness alone with no knowledge of the timelines closing in around us both. The current carried me southeast through the first hour precisely as Mara had said it would. I felt the difference immediately, not like paddling against resistance. The raft moved with intention, drawn by water running 6 feet below the surface, invisible, absent from every chart I'd relied on across 40 years, but entirely real. I didn't fight it. Let it do the work. Kept the paddle ready for small corrections, but mostly I just rode. 4:30 in the morning, fog still impenetrable past the raft's edge. Cold, not the hypothermia kind. The steady grinding cold that accumulates over hours and erodes you. I was still wearing the clothes I'd come to on 5 days ago. Salt-crusted, torn, but dry enough to function. 30 hours and 26 minutes to Nolan's board meeting. I didn't need to look at the watch to hold that number. It had been running in my head from the moment I pushed off the sand. The fog began to relent around 5:30. Not lifting fully, just thinning enough to open maybe 50 yards of visibility. Gray, water, gray sky, no horizon to speak of, just shifting gradations of gray and silence. Not the silence of the island. That silence had edges, trees, cliffs, cave walls. You could hear wind threading through pine waves meeting specific rocks, the sound of your own feet on sand. This was different. Ocean silence is boundless. No edges, no limits, just water in every direction, the sound of the paddle breaking the surface and your own breathing. Complete isolation in the truest sense. On the island I'd been alone, but enclosed, trees, cliffs, cave walls, something to measure against. Out here, I was alone in the mathematical way, the only fixed point inside 360 degrees of empty water. I paddled, shifted my angle slightly east around 6 o'clock the way Mara had told me to watch the sky pale somewhere behind the overcast sun, invisible, just the gray brightening incrementally. 7 in the morning. Shoulders burning, hands locking up around the grip. The paddle was rough-shaped driftwood built for function without any thought of comfort. Every stroke dragged across raw skin. Then I spotted something. A small bright point on the horizon. Due southeast, not the sun-wrong angle, not a wave too fixed. Something else. I stopped paddling and held my gaze on it, wondering if the exhaustion or residual cold was manufacturing something that wasn't there. The point didn't drift, didn't dissolve. I dug the paddle in and pushed harder. How many strokes can a 65-year-old body produce before the arms simply refuse? I was going to find out. 7 to 8. 8 to 9. 9 to 10. The hours lost their edges. Paddle. Correct the angle. Paddle. Rest 30 seconds. Then paddle again. The bright point grew, but so gradually I couldn't separate real progress from wishful thinking. Around 10 o'clock, the fog broke entirely. Blue sky, sunlight, open water to the horizon, and the mainland, a dark ridge of mountains to the southeast, maybe 60 miles off. The bright spot sat between me and that ridge, and it was getting bigger. 11 o'clock, my hands were bleeding. The blisters had split open, then torn back further. Salt water found every one of them. Each stroke registered it. I kept paddling. Noon. Sun directly overhead, heat now instead of cold. The risk had shifted from hypothermia to dehydration. Mara had packed water in a seal bladder. I rationed it 2 sips per hour. Not enough, but it had to last. The spot was unambiguously growing. Not something my mind was inventing. Something real. 100. 2. 3. My body was shutting down in the ordered way bodies do, under prolonged duress, shoulders seizing back, nodding hands, barely maintaining their grip on the shaft. 65 years old, 40 years on the water. None of that readied me for this. But the spot kept getting bigger. 400. Enough detail to read now. White hull, angular lines moving a vessel. 500. Definitely a ship, Coast Guard cutter. I knew the profile. It was tracking southeast perpendicular to my heading. If they didn't pick me up on a visual, they'd pass inside a mile and leave me behind. I stopped paddling, rose carefully to my feet on the raft, balanced on legs that were shaking badly. Both arms over my head. The vessel held its course. I kept waving 30 seconds a minute. 2. Arms screaming, legs trembling. The raft pitching beneath me, and then the vessel changed course. Hard turn directly toward me. They had me. I dropped back down onto the raft, breathing like I'd just run a race. Watched them close the gap. 500 yards, 300, 100. 6:15 p.m. The cutter cut engines 50 yards out. A searchlight swept across the water procedural. Even with the sun still up, I recognized the protocol. The beam found me and held. Officers moved on deck with that particular brand of competence that comes from running the same drill for years. One was already on the radio, gesturing as he talked. They had procedures for man overboard, for cold water rescue, for medical emergency. When that light swept across me and stopped, I finally let myself believe I'd come through this. They launched a small boat, 2 officers. It crossed the gap in 30 seconds and came alongside the raft. "Warren Holt," one of them called. I stared at him. They already knew my name. I hadn't spoken yet, hadn't identified myself, and they knew who I was. Someone had reported me. Someone had given them coordinates and a name. "Yes," I said. My voice was hoarse from salt and dehydration and 14 hours of silence. "Warren Holt, sir, we're going to bring you aboard," the officer said. "Can you stand?" Barely. They got me off the raft and into the smaller boat. Left the driftwood raft where it sat on the water. "Evidence," they said. "Crime scene." Crime scene which told me someone had made clear this wasn't an accident. Someone had told them I'd been put there deliberately. But who? They brought me alongside the cutter. More hands reaching down from the deck. They pulled me up, draped a thermal blanket across my shoulders. Someone was running through vitals. Someone else was asking questions: name, age, medical conditions, how long exposed. I answered on autopilot while my eyes moved across the deck. The officer standing next to me was trying to keep up. "Who called you?" I asked. "Who flagged me as missing?" He glanced at his partner, something passing between them without words. "FBI coordinated the search, sir," he said. "We'll brief you fully once you're warm and stable. You're safe. You're going home." FBI, not Nolan, not the company federal agents, meaning someone had gone witness. I sat on that deck inside a thermal blanket, salt-dried and bleeding and hollowed out with exhaustion, and understood that the trap I'd built had grown beyond what I'd designed it to be. They got me onto the Coast Guard deck at 6:12 p.m. on June 3rd. I know the exact time because the first thing I did once my boots were on steel was look at my watch. 2 days, 14 hours, 47 minutes since Nolan had left me on that island. I didn't go down. I didn't vomit. I settled onto a storage crate jacket, still stiff with salt shoulders squared, and looked at the young officer watching me like I'd come back from somewhere no one comes back from. "Sir," he said, "we need to get you below deck. Medical evaluation, warm fluids, and..." "What time is it?" He blinked. 6:12 p.m., sir, but you really need to..." I checked my watch again, leather strap, darkened with seawater, face scratched, still running. "I need clean clothes, a phone, and a vehicle standing by at the Port of Portland. I have a meeting at Pioneer Tower on Southwest 5th Avenue tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The officer I'd learned he was Lieutenant Garrett Dunn, 34 years old, 12 years Coast Guard, bronze hair already pulling back at the temples, stood with a thermal blanket in both hands and didn't move. "Mr. Holt," he said carefully, "you've been missing for 2 days. You were reported left on an uninhabited island. We pulled your raft from the water 14 miles offshore. You need medical attention, not I need a vehicle." I stood. Legs held despite all of it, the raft, the hours, the dehydration, everything. Clean clothes first, then a phone. Don't contact my family. Don't contact the company. Contact the FBI. "Agent Brixton Calder. Tell him Warren Holt is alive and needs transport to Portland by 9 p.m. tonight." Dunn's mouth opened and then closed. Behind him, 2 other crew members wore identical expressions. "Sir, the nearest hospital is..." I met his eyes, and whatever he found there made him take a step back. "Hospital after, vehicle first, FBI only. Those are my instructions, Lieutenant." He took a long look at me. 65 years old. Clothes, salt-stiffened hair, matted with ocean spray. Hands rope-burned from the paddle, and I watched the understanding register. This wasn't a rescue. It was a pickup. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I'll make the call." 65 years old, 14 hours on the open water, and I still occupied that deck like I was running the meeting. Because I was. They found me clean clothes from the officers' quarters, charcoal gray pants, white dress shirt that almost fit. I washed my face at a steel sink, hands shaking for the first time, and studied what the mirror offered back. 2 days of growth on my jaw, sunburn across both cheekbones, eyes that had aged 10 years. But alive. I dried my watch carefully and checked the small recording indicator. Still active, still secure. 47 minutes and 23 seconds of audio had pushed to the upload servers the moment we'd come into satellite range that morning. Nolan's voice. His own words laying out everything. At 9 p.m., exactly, the FBI vehicle was staged at the port of Portland when the cutter docked. Agent Brixton Calder was standing next to a black sedan. Same wrinkled suit I remembered from the fraud inquiry into our company 3 years prior. Same sharp eyes that cataloged everything and discarded nothing. Mr. Holt. He pulled open the rear door. Get in. No pleasantries, no inquiry about my condition. I respected him more for it. He handed me a water bottle and a folder as soon as I was seated. Celinda Ferris gave her statement yesterday, he said. Full confession. The Prudhoe Bay fraud. The money laundering run through Holt Maritime Holdings. The plan to strand you. She provided coordinates, financial records, the full picture. We have what we need for arrest warrants. I finished half the bottle before I said anything. The board meeting was pushed to 8 a.m. tomorrow. Your assistant Petra Wynne carried out your instructions, forwarded the sealed file to us 48 hours after your disappearance. The evidence you assembled across the past 6 months gave us everything. Calder's eyes found mine in the rear view. Nolan doesn't know you're alive yet. Celinda hasn't told him. We can move on him tonight or hold until tomorrow morning. Your call. I looked out the window at Portland's lights laid across the surface of the Willamette River. Somewhere across the city, Nolan was in his Pearl District townhouse sleeping his way toward what he thought was his 8 a.m. coronation. Tomorrow, I said. At the meeting. I want to see his face. Calder nodded slowly. There's one thing Celinda's testimony didn't account for. She said Nolan flew you to the island, but she wasn't present for the conversation. What Warren is carrying with him across that water is about to change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who thought they had already won. Before we get to that moment, I want to ask you something. If you had evidence that someone close to you had been plotting against you, would you confront them the instant you had it? Or would you wait until the moment it would matter most? Circumstantial evidence of abandonment, that's all we had. Nothing that proved intent. A sharp defense attorney could build a case around mechanical failure, a forced landing, Nolan fully intending to return. But none of that touches what I'm carrying. I have the conversation. Silence in the car. Calder's eyes found mine in the rear view. I raised my wrist. The antique watch leather strap cracked white with salt silver case scored and dull. The tiny modified recording mechanism buried inside invisible, unless you knew its address. 47 minutes and 23 seconds, I said quietly. From the moment we touched down to the moment that plane banked away. Every word. You'll die here and I'll run the company you built. Verbatim. Recorded. Pushed to a secure server the instant we crossed into satellite range. Calder studied the watch, then looked at me and offered nothing. The car threaded Portland traffic, the market, the waterfront Holt Shipping's offices dark behind their glass. His phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He left it there. When he finally spoke, his voice was level. The recording holds up. Oregon's a single-party consent state. I was present in that exchange. Every word is admissible. I set the empty water bottle down. I've been taping board meetings for 40 years, Agent Calder. This was no different. Jesus. A slow exhale. Does Nolan know the watch does that? He never thought to ask. I ran my thumb over the scratched crystal. Old habits, old tools. He stopped paying any attention years ago. The FBI car reached downtown Portland at 9:30 p.m., 11 hours ahead of Nolan's board meeting. Brixton Calder held arrest warrants, Celinda's testimony, and 47 minutes of audio confession. For the first time in 20 hours, I let my eyes close. The hotel room was clean, warm, and profoundly quiet, the first real sense of safety in 6 days. Calder dropped me at the Nines Hotel at 10:15 p.m., left me a key card and a phone charger, and said he'd knock at 7:30 a.m. No detail outside the door, nobody watching, just the 18th floor white sheets, curtains that sealed out the world, and a silence so deep my ears began to ring. I stood at the window, a full 20 minutes, Portland's lights bleeding through eyes still raw from salt. Across the city somewhere, Nolan was asleep. Come 8 a.m., he'd stride into that boardroom certain the throne was his. What he'd find instead was me. At 11 p.m., I stepped into the shower and let the water work through 2 days of ocean salt and island grime. The rope burns across my palms bit hard under the spray. Mara's lessons had been the margin between living and not the raft, the tides the discipline to hold still and wait for rescue rather than drowning trying to swim out. I owed her everything, and I'd make sure the Bureau heard her name clearly when they came for her account. Midnight found me horizontal, clean, warm, hollowed out. Sleep didn't come. The room was sealed against sound in a way the island never was. No surf, no wind, no fire popping, no Mara's voice tracing her grandfather's fishing routes. Only hotel stillness, and far below the low groan of ship horns drifting up from the Willamette River. I lay in the dark, and my mind kept pulling back to Nolan at 8 years old, pressed against the office window, watching the sky go strange before a storm. Why does it turn green, Dad? Why not red or purple breath, clouding the glass eyes on the Columbia River estuary? I'd been deep in a call-delayed cargo, some crisis that felt like the world then and reads as nothing now. I covered the receiver long enough to say, "Light refraction, son. Ask your mother." He nodded and walked off. I went back to my call. When did that child become the man who drugged me and left me on an island to die? I worked through every memory I owned, hunting for the seam, the exchange, the rupture, the exact before and after. There had to be a hinge. I couldn't locate it. What I found instead was a catalog of small erasures, a school play missed for a board session in Eugene. His graduation, I sat through the ceremony, then slipped out before dinner because a deal had a deadline. The day he came aboard and asked to lead the Alaska expansion, and I told him, "Start in operations first, learn the real business." His face moved through 3 expressions: open, guarded, gone. 1,000 quiet abandonments, each defensible, each necessary, each one another brick. Until he stood on that island and said, "You'll die here and I'll run the company you built." Not one moment. 20 years of them chosen and unchosen, and I'd looked away from every single one. When does a father lose his son in a single conversation or across 1,000 silences he never stopped to count? At 3 a.m., I surrendered and pulled my chair to the window, watching Portland's skyline hold still in the dark. The watch lay on the nightstand strap, cracked salt pale, the recording mechanism catching the lamplight. 47 minutes and 23 seconds. Nolan's own voice delivered to FBI servers the moment we hit satellite range on June 2nd. Evidence and something worse. My son preserved forever in a file describing how he wanted me dead. I thought about Celinda somewhere in federal protection working through her testimony. She'd cared for Nolan once, maybe some fragment of that survived, warped and scarred. Had she been present for the moments I'd walked past? Had she watched him change and tried to reach him, redirect him, or had she helped him build the whole thing and taken her 30 pieces of silver when the work was done? At 5 a.m., I dressed in what Calder had left, a borrowed FBI suit, navy blue one, full size too large, faintly carrying another man's detergent. I faced the bathroom mirror and met a stranger. Not the boardroom version in tailored wool, not the captain in salt-stiff gear, just a 65-year-old man in clothes that didn't fit, about to go dismantle his son. The face looking back was worn old, but the eyes weren't soft. I'd known since January. 6 months of tracking Nolan's movements, logging his sessions with Celinda, documenting the Prudhoe Bay fraud piece by piece, stacking the evidence. I'd known and let it run because I had to see how far he'd actually go. Had to know whether the boy who once fogged that office window still had any brakes or whether he'd drive it all the way through. He'd driven it all the way through. At 7:30 a.m., Calder rapped on the door. Same creased suit, same alert eyes, 2 coffees and a cardboard tray. "Breakfast," he said, and handed one across. "Black, no sugar." He'd filed that away from the drive-in. I took it standing at the window. Burnt, bitter tasting of every bad cup before a fight that mattered. Exactly right. "Arrest team's set," Calder said. "You go in ahead. Let Nolan see you. Give him a beat to react the moment he confirms he believed you were dead. We come through. Simple. Simple. My son in handcuffs. My son's life folding into charges in a courtroom. Simple." We rode the elevator to the 40th floor at 7:50 a.m. without a word. Calder's eyes were on his phone. Mine were on the watch, not the hands. The mechanism, the proof, the recording that would put Nolan away for 20 years. The corridor outside the boardroom was hushed, charcoal carpet, a trace of coffee and furniture wax in the air. Through the frosted door panels I could make out shapes: Nolan, the board, Celinda's empty chair. Calder stopped 10 feet from the door, ready. I looked down at my wrist. Salt-stripped strap, scratched crystal. Not reading the time, touching it the way a sailor lays a hand on a compass before the weather turns. The borrowed suit pulled wrong at the shoulders. I'd walked into harder rooms in worse gear. I straightened the loose cuff. Ready since January of this year. Calder's eyes shifted slightly, a recognition moving across them. Not a man reacting to survival, but one who'd been building toward this for 5 months. Letting Nolan believe he was winning, letting every crime compound, every confession land, every step carry him deeper into ground with no exit. 7:56 a.m., 4 minutes out. I crossed the hall and pressed my palm to the door. My hand pushed the boardroom door open at 7:56 a.m. June 4th. Inside Nolan, 4 board members, Celinda's empty chair, and 47 minutes of audio evidence already on FBI servers for the past 3 hours. The door swung wide. The room opened at 8 o'clock sharp, and Nolan's pen went still above the signature line. I walked in first. Behind me, 6 federal officers, 4 FBI agents, Brixton Calder among them, 2 Coast Guard Lieutenant Garrett Dunn among them, everyone in uniform, everyone silent. None of it was chance. Calder had threaded the timing precisely my entrance at the exact instant Nolan's pen touched paper, the exact second he sealed the final act of corporate theft. Nolan's hand locked mid-signature. The pen hung over the line reading Nolan Holt, acting CEO, for 3 seconds. Then it dropped to the mahogany, a small sound. The whole room heard it. I wore a borrowed FBI suit, one size too large navy blue instead of my usual charcoal gray. My hair was still crusted with ocean salt from 2 days of Alaskan wind. I hadn't touched a razor. I looked precisely like what I was, a 65-year-old man left for dead on a remote island who'd found his way back. I moved the length of the boardroom without rushing past Hector Albridge, who half lifted himself from his seat and then lowered back down. Past Curtis Renwick, whose coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Past Dina Holloway, whose face traveled from confusion to recognition to something close to horror across 5 slow steps. Past Celinda's vacant chair, past my son, who looked at me the way a man looks at a ghost, which in a sense was exactly what I was. I reached the chairman's seat at the far end of the table, the leather chair I'd occupied for 40 years, the one Nolan had planned to claim in roughly 30 seconds, and I sat down. A man returning from a long journey. The silence held for 10 seconds. 15. 20. Morning light came through floor-to-ceiling windows, laying itself across the polished table, across the unsigned transfer documents, across Nolan's motionless face. Hector Albridge found his voice. First among them, Warren. 62 years old, 23 years on the board. Silver hair precisely trimmed, still sharp enough to read the federal uniforms and know what they signaled. What's going on? I gave no answer. I was watching Nolan, my son. 38 years old, 6'2", wearing a $10,000 suit cut to fit every inch of him. The successful executive he'd spent 15 years building himself into rose slowly from his chair. His hand left the pen resting on the table. His shoulders drew back. His face arranged itself into an expression of outrage so convincing I nearly believed it myself. Nearly. "This is outrageous," he said. His voice was smooth, measured, persuasive, the voice I'd coached him on when he was 23 and still learning to negotiate shipping contracts. My father vanished 5 days ago. We've had everyone looking, the Coast Guard, the FBI, every resource available. And now he walks in flanked by federal agents like some kind of spectacle. Brixton Calder stepped forward, FBI credentials extended. "You have the right to remain silent." But Nolan wasn't done. He was still the finest persuader I'd ever known. Even now, 6 federal officers in the room, he leaned on the gift he'd inherited from me, from the version of me at 30 who could bring a reluctant client around to a 5-year contract, who could flip a hostile negotiation into a handshake. He turned to the board, dismissing Calder entirely. "There is no evidence," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "My father left on his own terms. He wanted to fish, wanted solitude. What you're witnessing is a conspiracy, a hostile takeover dressed up in federal intimidation to strip control of this corporation." Curtis Renwick glanced at me, then back at Nolan. Dina Holloway's eyes moved between us. Salt-worn father in a borrowed suit, impeccably turned-out son, radiating confidence. The pen struck mahogany with a sound like a gavel. Nolan kept talking. "Where's Celinda? She'll confirm everything. She was with me when we dropped him at the fishing site. She saw it." "Ms. Ferris is in federal protection," Calder said quietly. "She gave her statement yesterday. All of it." Nolan's voice didn't waver. "Then you know I'm telling the truth. We dropped him at an uninhabited island 60 miles from the nearest settlement." My first words since walking through the door. The silence shifted heavier, now different in texture. Nolan turned to look at me. Truly look at me. His eyes moved across the salt-stiffened hair, the ill-fitting borrowed suit, the rope burns still visible at my cuffs. "Dad," his tone shifted softer, concerned, now the dutiful son. "What happened?" "We've been frantic. When you didn't come back from the fishing trip, when we couldn't reach you, we thought—" "Stop." He stopped. I looked at my son for a long moment. At the face I had watched travel from infant to child to man. At the eyes that once asked me why storm skies turned green. At the expression now quietly calculating how much I knew, how much I could prove, how much damage still needed containing. For the first time in 38 years, my son could not hold my gaze. "Do you remember your grandfather's watch?" I asked, my voice quiet. Nolan's eyes dropped to my wrist, to the old marine timepiece with its scratched crystal and salt-darkened leather strap. The watch his grandfather had worn crossing the Pacific in 1951. The watch I'd had on my wrist every single day for 40 years. The watch Nolan had seen 1,000 times without truly seeing just an old man's attachment to an outdated piece of hardware. I watched understanding move across his face. Watched the confidence drain the way water leaves a vessel taking on the sea. Watched him remember the island, our conversation, his confession, every syllable spoken while he stood over me in front of that beached float plane. Every word delivered while I sat there wearing my grandfather's watch, its recording mechanism concealed inside the antique case, uploading to satellite servers the moment we came within signal range 36 hours later. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "How long?" he whispered. I adjusted my cuff, letting him see the watch clearly. 47 minutes and 23 seconds of audio. His voice saying, "You'll die here and I'll run the company you built." His voice detailing the Prudhoe Bay fraud. His voice admitting everything. "Long enough," I said. Nolan's eyes stayed fixed on the old marine watch, the one his grandfather wore crossing the Pacific in 1951, the one he'd always dismissed as sentiment. His face changed when the full weight of 47 minutes of island audio landed on him. The persuader had run out of words. I pressed the button without a word of explanation. My grandfather's watch had a speaker function modified years ago for recording board sessions triggered by a specific sequence of crown turns. The room's audio system picked up the signal on its own. I offered no preamble, no framing. I pressed play and let my son's voice fill the boardroom. The recording opened with the sounds of that night. Waves against rocks, wind moving through spruce, the hollow scrape of aluminum dragging across reef the canoe Nolan had deliberately grounded to make my death appear accidental. Then his voice crystalline in the June Alaskan dark. "You understand what happens now, don't you?" My own voice, older, uncertain. "The canoe's stuck." "The canoe's not stuck. It's positioned, 3 miles offshore on an uninhabited island with no scheduled traffic. The old man becomes prey to predators or dies of thirst within 72 hours. Either way, outdated maritime thinking proves worthless when modern strategy leaves you behind." Hector Albridge's face went white. Curtis Renwick set his coffee cup down with a clink that rang out in the frozen room. Dina Holloway stared at the speaker, then at Nolan, then back at the speaker. The recording ran on 47 minutes and 23 seconds in full, every word, every detail. Nolan laying out the Prudhoe Bay fraud. Nolan describing how the missing funds were buried. His voice smooth and assured and utterly damning. "The corporation belongs to my wife and me now. The board meeting is just a formality. By the time anyone recovers your body, if they find it at all, I'll have been CEO for 3 months. Grief-stricken son, tragic accident, seamless transition." I sat perfectly still in the chairman's chair and watched my son stand rigid 10 feet away, watched the color leave his face, watched his hands clench and open and clench again at his sides. No one else moved. Hector's pen had been traveling toward his notepad when the recording began. It stayed there, suspended for 5 minutes. 10, 15. The audio was extraordinary in its clarity. My grandfather's watch had cost $800 in 1951, worth perhaps $12,000 today, and the recording mechanism I'd installed 5 years ago had run another $3,000. Money well spent. Every syllable of Nolan's confession came through without distortion. "Celinda handled the financial restructuring," his recorded voice. "She's brilliant with shell corporations. The Alaska operation gave us perfect cover, remote location, complex logistics, easy-to-bury discrepancies in operational costs. $4 million over 18 months, and the auditors never questioned it." Dina Holloway set her pen down. Hector followed. Curtis had never lifted his. The recording continued. Nolan's voice describing the island, no fresh water, no shelter, no emergency supplies. Nolan's voice tallying my survival odds. 72 hours maximum, probably less. He's 65, not the ship captain he used to be. The exposure alone will... 45, 46, 47 minutes. The timestamp in the corner of the audio player climbed steadily. 0045, 0046, 0047. 47 minutes is a long time when every second dismantles your son. The final minute was mostly silence, the sound of a vessel engine turning over. My recorded voice asking where he was going. Nolan's answer, "Portland, The board meeting is in 4 days. I need to prepare my remarks. Goodbye, Dad. Propeller noise, then fading engine sound, then waves and wind, then my own voice barely there. He's gone. Recording stopped. The timestamp read 00:47:23, and the playback ended. 10 seconds of complete silence. Then Calder stepped forward, warrant in hand. "Nolan Holt," he said, his voice formal and drained of feeling. "You are under arrest for first-degree murder, attempted murder, and federal corporate fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Nolan's head jerked back. "Murder. Attempted murder. Yes, but I never—" August 23rd, 2022. Calder kept going. Engineer Owen Pratt, aged 29, vanished from Holt Shipping's Valdez facility. Ms. Ferris's cooperation gave the FBI the coordinates of the island where you stranded your father. At the abandoned campsite, we recovered blood, personal effects, and forensic evidence pointing to homicide. Pratt had uncovered the Prudhoe Bay fraud. You silenced him to keep it buried. The air in the room seemed to go cold. Calder laid out 3 federal charges. The prosecutor would push for consecutive sentencing across all counts. No plea bargain, no arrangement, no discussion. A judge would deliver the rest. Nolan turned and found my eyes actually found them for the first time since the playback had stopped. The color had drained from his face. That perfectly tailored suit looked somehow disheveled now, and his hands weren't steady. I held his gaze, said nothing, didn't shift in my seat. There were no words left worth saying. The small boy who once wanted to know why the sky turns green before a storm had been gone for 4 decades. The person across this table had put a 29-year-old engineer in the ground to protect stolen money, then tried to put his own father in the ground to protect a title. I had sat on that island and listened to him narrate my death for 47 minutes. Whatever I might have said to him, I'd already heard it all. His mouth opened and shut. His eyes dropped to the pen lying on the floor beside the mahogany table, the one that had slid from his fingers the moment I'd walked in an hour ago. That pen on the floor was a kind of marker, a before and after. Neither of us was going to touch it again. 2 agents stepped in from the perimeter, the cuffs locked around Nolan's wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. They recited his rights, the same words I'd absorbed from crime dramas over a lifetime, now landing differently when said 10 feet away about my only child. He didn't pull back or argue. He let them walk him toward the door, spine still straight, chin level, whatever remained of his bearing intact. At the doorway, he turned and looked at me one last time. I looked back at him. Nothing was said. No plea for forgiveness, no parting word, no acknowledgement of anything that had come before. 2 men who had shared a name and a bloodline, each understanding that 47 minutes of recorded voice had closed whatever remained open between them. The door swung shut at 9:02 a.m. June 4th. Every sound in the boardroom died with it. Hector Curtis and Dina sat at the table like figures in a photograph. Calder collected his materials. Nolan's unsigned transfer documents were still fanned out in front of his vacant chair. I remained in the chairman's seat, wearing a suit that belonged to someone else, my eyes on the fallen pen below the table's edge. The company was back in my hands. I had never felt so gutted. I pressed my palm flat against the table. There's still one matter the board needs to hear. The 3 of them had already started reaching for their things. Briefcases, clasped, phones, pocketed coffee cups, untouched since the recording had begun an hour before. They went still. Hector settled slowly back into his chair. I crossed to the door and pulled it open. Waiting in the corridor was the woman I'd telephoned 2 hours earlier with instructions to have a specific set of documents on the 40th floor, no later than 9 a.m. Petra Wynn, 46 years old, had been my private attorney for 11 years. Silver-streaked hair drawn back with characteristic efficiency, a leather briefcase in hand that had seen more years of use than most people in this building. She had managed everything that happened outside the corporate record since my wife died: estate arrangements, property transfers, the work that never makes the filings. "Ms. Wynn," I said, "please come in," I said. She set the briefcase on the table without ceremony. 3-click combination lock lid open. Inside were papers I'd put my signature to 6 months earlier in her downtown office on a January morning, with Portland rain driving against the glass Nolan had left maybe an hour before, after our usual monthly breakfast. I had known sitting there, known 6 months ahead of the island, ahead of the Coast Guard rescue, ahead of 47 minutes of audio that would end my son's freedom. I had known, and so I had acted. January 15th, 2023, I said, letting my eyes move across the board members' faces. I transferred my personal holdings into an irrevocable trust, approximately $80 million across real estate investment accounts and liquid assets. Ms. Wynne serves as trustee. Petra laid the pages out on the table. My signature ran across everyone. 27 pages total, notarized, filed, legally unbreakable. The sole beneficiary, I went on, is my grandson Cole Holt, age 4. The trust releases to him at 25. Neither Nolan nor Celinda holds any interest or authority over these assets. They are sealed until Cole reaches that age. Dina's eyes went wide. Curtis came forward in his chair. Hector's face moved through confusion and arrived somewhere close to respect. My corporate shares, I said, sit separately under the existing shareholder agreement. Right of first refusal, board approval required for any transfer, mandatory priority offer to fellow shareholders. Everything Nolan built his scheme around was already legally out of reach before he put that drug in my drink. The elegance of the arithmetic was precise. 18 months, Nolan had invested in fraud, a killing, and a corporate grab. One January morning, I had invested in documents that made the whole enterprise worth nothing. He would walk out of prison with nothing. His son would eventually hold everything. That is what consequence looks like when the math is done correctly. Hector cleared his throat. Why the grandson? Careful phrasing. Genuinely curious. Why not give it away? Break it up, any other option? I looked at Nolan's empty chair, at the unsigned papers in front of it, at the pen still lying where it had fallen, at the room where I had spent 40 years assembling something only to watch my son spend 47 minutes in the dark of an Alaskan island trying to take it. The boy did nothing wrong, I said, keeping my voice low. I want him to face a different set of choices than his father was given. Silence. 10 full seconds. Petra returned the documents to the briefcase and snapped it shut. 3 clicks. Copies will go to the board. I said, for your records, we're adjourned. They filed out, Hector first, then Curtis, then Dina. Each one paused at the door. Hector's hand came to rest on my shoulder for 3 seconds. Curtis gave a slow nod. Dina whispered, I'm sorry that I pretended not to hear. Petra went last, briefcase against her hip, and the look she gave me carried the weight of 6 months what keeping that knowledge had required of me, watching Nolan step toward every wire I'd laid, recording every admission, letting the whole mechanism run to its end. Then the door was closed, and I was alone in the boardroom for 5 minutes before I walked out. By 2:30 p.m., I was seated across from Brixton Calder in his office at the downtown FBI building. Gray walls, standard-issue government furniture, desk coffee that tasted like it had been scorched and left to cool twice over. I drank it. Ms. Ferris has entered a guilty plea, Calder said, a folder spread open before him. Complicity in corporate fraud, accessory to attempted murder. Her early cooperation and testimony secured a substantially reduced outcome under the federal agreement, 18 months at a minimum security federal facility, 2 years of supervised release, to follow a $500,000 fine, and a lifetime prohibition on holding any CFO or senior finance position at any corporation. He raised his eyes. The prosecutor is prepared to pursue heavier charges if you want that. The evidence supports it. She was woven into the fraud at every level, had advanced knowledge of what was planned for the island, and helped put the logistics in motion. Additional counts are available. I'd already had that conversation with the federal prosecutor in the 30 minutes Calder had set aside for me that morning before the board meeting convened. What I told her then was the same thing I gave Calder now. I spoke to her before I came upstairs, I said. We were in agreement. Celinda's cooperation warranted the plea as structured. 18 months gives a person time to sit with what they've done. I won't be pushing to attach personal charges on top of what the federal case already carries. Calder sat back and looked at me with something between appraisal and puzzlement. For someone whose death she was involved in planning, that's a restrained position. Being measured is what kept me alive on that island, I said. Every decision Nolan made, he made himself. Celinda made one decision that counted for anything. She picked up the phone and called you, rather than hanging back to see what Nolan would do when she became a liability. I can extend something for that. How many lives does one betrayal have to take before justice is satisfied? Nolan would die in federal custody. Owen Pratt was already dead, killed at 29 because he'd found the wrong spreadsheet. Cole would spend his childhood without a father and come into money at 25 from a grandfather he'd barely have a memory of. Celinda would surrender her profession, her standing, 18 months of her life. How much further did the ledger need to run? The CFO prohibition, though, I said. That one I won't bend on. Permanent. No financial authority at any company anywhere for the rest of her career. Calder put his pen to the file. It's already in there. Her attorney accepted it without a word. Then there's nothing left to discuss, I said. He shut the folder and put out his hand. I took its solid grip, unhurried the handshake of someone who had watched me hauled off a Coast Guard cutter 2 days ago and had personally read my son his rights this morning. "Mr. Holt," he said, "I hope you get some peace out of this." I gave him a nod and walked out. The FBI building released me at 3:40 p.m. into a June afternoon that was bright and indifferent Portland, carrying on around me as though the day were ordinary. People heading to lunch, visitors pointing cameras at the waterfront, the city's whole unremarkable rhythm intact, none of it knowing that somewhere inside that morning a son had been taken into custody by his father's hand. The corporation was intact. Nolan was in a cell. Celinda was resolved. My grandson's future was secure. For the first time in 6 months, there was nothing waiting on the other side of the next decision. Before I could leave downtown, the FBI routed me to a private medical clinic. Standard protocol following a survival situation, Calder told me. Confirm nothing had ruptured during the raft crossing. Assess for delayed shock. Document physical condition for the trial record. Dr. Abby Heron was 44 years old, efficient in her movements, dark hair threaded with gray clipped back. The kind of doctor who has processed enough hard cases to know which questions waste everyone's time. She checked my vitals, examined the rope burns across my palms, swept a light across both eyes, pressed a stethoscope to my chest. Moderate dehydration, she said, entering notes on a tablet. Muscle fatigue in line with sustained physical effort. Minor abrasions from what appeared to be plant fiber, most likely from the raft vines. All things considered, she added, given your age, and what I was told about the circumstances, your condition is better than it has any right to be. 40 years at sea, I said. She nodded and left me to change back into the borrowed FBI suit. I sat on the exam table, paper crackling beneath me, and for the first time since I'd pushed through those boardroom doors 12 hours earlier, I let myself stop. Stop moving. Stop calculating. Stop running the sequence I'd been executing across 6 months of watching my son engineer my death. I went still. What I felt wasn't victory, it was loss. The corporation was intact. Nolan was in custody. My grandson's future was protected. Every piece of the plan had landed where I'd put it. By any accounting, I had won. But I had lost my son long before that island. Maybe when he was 12 and asked to go fishing and I had a client dinner instead. Maybe when he was 18 and came to me about college and I was in Eugene closing an acquisition. Maybe when he was 25 and asked me directly why I had never told him I was proud of him, and I answered by handing him a promotion rather than the words. 1,000 small absences, and I was only now willing to call them what they were. My phone buzzed. Alaska area code, a number I didn't have in my contacts. I answered. "Is it done?" Mara's voice came through fragmented satellite interference layering beneath every syllable. I paused. "How did you get this number?" The Coast Guard had coordinated with the tribal council when they filed the rescue report, she said. Leonard Clearwater passed it to her the day before. A pause filled with the sound of wind. She was outside somewhere, the beach most likely. Old habit, she said. I like to know how things end. No introduction, no explanation needed. 3 days on that island had taught us to communicate in the stripped-down language of people who know that survival has no patience for extra words. "It's done," I said. Static, wind, silence. She was out there on that beach, probably standing at the same waterline where I'd shoved the raft into the dark 60 hours before. "The island," I said. "Before I walked into that boardroom this morning, my attorney filed conservation commitment documents. Federal designation, permanent protection, no development, no extraction, no mineral surveys, no exceptions. The tribal council will have formal notification within 30 days. Silence again. 10 seconds. 15. Then Mara's voice lower than I'd ever heard it from her. "Okay." Not gratitude. No talk of staying in touch. Just confirmation that I had done what I said I would. People who have been failed repeatedly don't put weight on promises, they wait to see what gets done. Mara had just registered that something got done. The line cut out. I sat in the exam room for another 5 minutes holding a phone connected to nothing, then dressed and walked out. I postponed the prison visit twice. The first time I told myself corporate restructuring demanded my attention. The second time I admitted the truth, I was afraid. July 15th. I finally went. Federal detention, gray concrete, reinforced glass, the smell of industrial cleaner that almost but never quite covers what's underneath. They walked me to a visiting room with a phone and a partition. No physical contact permitted for pre-trial detainees facing life sentences. Nolan came through the door in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He'd lost weight. His eyes were swollen at the rims. When he lifted the phone on his side of the glass, his hand trembled. "Dad," his voice broke, "why are you doing this to me? Why won't you give me any chance at all? I made mistakes. I know that. But you could speak to the prosecutor, you could." I let him keep going. Let the plea run its full length. Let him try the persuasion one more time. The gift he'd taken from me, the same talent I'd spent 3 decades sharpening in myself, now aimed at the man who taught him how to use it. When he finally ran out of words, I spoke quietly through the partition. "The night you left me on that island, I said saying what you said, fatherly love ended. Not because you hurt me, because I realized I hadn't truly known my own son for a long time. Some of that is on me. I should have looked harder, should have been present, but that doesn't alter what exists now." Nolan's face came apart. "What do you want from me?" I stood up. Nothing anymore. The iron door closed behind me with the sound of something final. I needed 5 minutes in the empty visiting room before I could make myself move. Sometimes it takes sitting inside an empty space to accept that the space is genuinely empty. 2 weeks after that, I restructured the company. Frank Corbin was 52 years old, a professional CEO carrying a 20-year record across mid-sized logistics operations, no family ties to Holt Shipping, no tangled history attached to any of it. A clean handover. The board voted unanimously to approve. I retained honorary chairman status, quarterly appearances, and advisory function, 0 operational reach. The trust held my shares. Corbin would take the wheel of what I'd spent 40 years building, and I would finally stop needing it as proof of who I was. We met in my former office on July 28th. I set the keys on the mahogany desk building Access Executive Suite company car and the small brass key to the file cabinet where I'd kept personal documents until Petra moved them to her office back in January. Corbin picked them up. Professional handshake firm, no theater, no lingering, just completion. "The company's in good shape," he said. "I'll take care of it." "I know," I said, and I left. I walked out of that building in late July carrying no keys, no title worth anything operational, no son, and $80 million sealed away in a trust for a 4-year-old who barely knew my face. Portland's summer sun was warm on my face. The waterfront looked exactly as it had 2 months earlier, when I'd flown north with Nolan believing we were reviewing Alaska operations together. The city was unchanged. I was the only thing that had changed. In August, I met my 4-year-old grandson for the first time since before the island. Not the first time ever. Cole had been born in the spring of 2019, and I had held him once in the hospital, a small, red-faced creature who smelled like new life and possibility. After that, Nolan and Celinda had managed the distance with practiced care. Packed schedules, clashing calendars, a grandfather who was always working a young family that needed room to breathe. I had accepted every one of those reasons because I was still the man who took the earnings call instead of the fishing trip, who sat through board sessions instead of school plays. The same man who had picked up the phone rather than explaining green storm skies to an 8-year-old. Now Nolan was in federal custody awaiting trial. Celinda was at a minimum security facility in Salem. Cole was living with a court-appointed guardian, a woman named Nora Fitch, 58 years old, retired social worker, deliberate and steady in the way that only comes from 30 years of absorbing other people's worst moments without being broken by them. I had arranged the meeting through Petra Wynn. 3 weeks of paperwork, background checks, and court approval. The family court judge was thorough. She had reviewed everything: the arrest warrant, the FBI case file summary, the trust documents executed in January. She had questions about my fitness as a grandparent. They were fair questions. A man whose son attempted to murder him is not automatically a safe figure for that son's child. I answered every question without hedging. The judge approved supervised visits, 2 hours per session. Nora Fitch present throughout. No discussion of Nolan or the ongoing legal proceedings. Standard protective order language that I read through 3 times and complied with without a single objection. We met at a small park in Nob Hill, 7 blocks from the apartment where Cole had spent all 4 years of his life. Nora brought him at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He had on a green jacket with a rocket ship on the pocket blue sneakers with Velcro straps, and an expression of complete indifference to the significance of the moment. He settled onto the bench beside me and immediately spotted the scar. I had stopped noticing it. The thin, pale line across my right palm, where the driftwood vine had cut during the raft work, the rope burns that Dr. Heron had recorded in the medical report, now healed into something that would stay. Cole reached out and touched it with one small finger, the way children make contact with anything that doesn't quite fit their understanding of the world. "What happened, Grandpa?" I looked at him, 4 years old, his father's blonde hair at that age, but his mother's eyes quick dark, already taking in everything around him with quiet attention. Children raised inside complicated households develop the ability to read a room long before they can read a page. "I went to the beach," I said. His eyes went wide. "Did you see a shark?" "Yes," I said, but the shark lost. He held me in a 3-second stare, weighing the claim. Then he gave a single nod, the grave, conclusive nod of a child who has reached a verdict, jumped down from the bench and sprinted toward the climbing structure at the park's center, shouting something about pirates. I watched him go up. Nora sat at the far end of the bench, close enough to keep watch, far enough to let the moment breathe. "He talks about sharks constantly," she said low. "Watches nature documentaries. His father used to sit with him on Sunday mornings for them." I said nothing. I watched my grandson haul himself to the top of the climbing structure and scan the park below him the way a captain sweeps a horizon. Some things get passed down even after the person who passed them is no longer there to know it. In September, I sat in a downtown conference room while Petra finished the last remaining item on a list that had taken 3 months to work through. The conservation documents for the island. It had run longer than I'd anticipated. The legal description demanded precise GPS coordinates, survey mapping, and coordination threading through 3 federal agencies: the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the EPA, and the National Park Service Regional Office in Juneau. Petra had managed every piece of it without a word of complaint, billing at her standard rate, never once suggesting that the tangle of it warranted any shortcut. The documents placed the island under permanent protection within the Tribal Council's stewardship. Native American Graves Protection Act designation. A federal environmental overlay, blocking mineral, commercial, or residential development of any kind. Irreversible. Shielded from future corporate interference, future legislative amendment at the state level, and any future court challenge brought by any Holt family member, including me. I had been direct about that last part. Petra had paused and looked at me when I said it. "You want to name yourself in the exclusion, especially myself," I said. Leonard Clearwater arrived at 2 o'clock. 71 years old, tribal elder, silver hair worn in a long braid, a traditional woven vest over a plain white shirt. He came empty-handed, no briefcase, no folder, no visible phone. He took the seat across the conference table and read every page himself slowly without posing a single question. 20 minutes. Petra sat quietly. I sat quietly. The September light tracked across the conference room floor. When he finished, Leonard looked up. "She said you would keep your word," he told me. I knew who he meant. Mara did not extend trust easily. When she did, she made sure the right people knew it. "I am a captain," I said. "A captain doesn't break promises made at sea." Leonard reached his hand across the table. I took its solid grip, the handshake of 2 men who both understood that certain agreements outweigh anything inscribed on paper, and that the paper exists solely to protect the agreement from those who weren't present when it was made. He signed. Petra notarized. I signed as the transferring party, formally relinquishing all Holt family claim to the island in perpetuity. The whole thing was concluded in 4 minutes. Leonard gathered the documents, rose, and gave one slow nod. Then he said something I hadn't anticipated. "There was a man who survived on that island before you," he said. "In 1986, a fishing boat went down in a storm. He came ashore, lasted 3 weeks before a passing vessel spotted his signal fire. When he returned home, he donated his fishing license to the Tribal Council and never worked those waters again." I looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because that island has a history of making men understand what they owe," he said. "You are not the first. You may not be the last." He left. I remained in the conference room for 10 minutes after Petra had packed her briefcase and excused herself. The September sun had crossed fully onto the floor, now warm and flat, the kind of light that makes a room look like a still image of itself. It occurred to me that the island had a name. I had never asked. 3 days I had lived on it, built a raft at its shoreline, slept inside its cave, and the question had never crossed my mind. I called Petra back. "The island," I said. "What is it called in the filing?" I heard paper moving. "Kagan Island," she said. "The name is from the tribal language. The council's documentation translates it as the place that returns what was lost." I wrote it on the conference room notepad, Kagan Island, tore the page off and slid it into my jacket pocket. Some names belong in your pocket. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when September air still carried the warmth of summer, I walked the length of Portland Marina at McCuddy's with no particular destination in mind. That was new for me. Movement without an objective. No meeting anchoring the far end of the walk. 40 years of ship's captaincy had conditioned me to move with intent, every step aimed at something, every journey plotted with a calculated return. Learning to walk without destination was harder work than building a driftwood raft had been. I moved past rows of slips, charter boats, pleasure craft, a handful of working fishing vessels whose owners I'd known by name across decades of maritime business. They nodded when they caught sight of me. I nodded back. None of them raised the subject of the island or Nolan or the federal case that had been running in the Portland papers for 6 weeks. Either they knew the whole of it already, or they understood that certain things don't call for conversation. I stopped at slip 31. The boat was a 38-foot, sloop-rigged sailboat built in the late 90s with the kind of construction that put durability ahead of looks. Hull wanting fresh paint rigging, sound, teak deck, weathered but well-maintained, a vessel that had been worked hard and looked after honestly. The seller was on deck replacing a halyard. Lester Quill, early 60s, hands built by decades of rope work, a face that had lived in weather for most of its life. "She for sale?" I asked. He looked up and took a moment with me the way one experienced sailor sizes up another. Not appearance posture. How a man holds himself near water tells you what he actually knows about it. "Might be," he said, "if the right buyer comes along." We talked for 20 minutes. He answered every question straight and volunteered the problems without being pushed. A tendency to carry weather helm in strong wind. A raw water pump, rebuilt twice, that would want replacing within 2 seasons. A depth sounder that occasionally gave false readings in shallow water. A man who leads with what's wrong with what he's selling has spent enough time at sea to know that concealed problems surface eventually. "Can this boat make the Gulf of Alaska solo?" I asked. He set the halyard down and looked at me steadily. "If you know how to sail," he said. "I know," I said. We settled on a price in 10 minutes. No back and forth. The number he put forward was fair, and we both recognized it. I bought the boat that afternoon, paid cash, signed the transfer papers on the dock with Lester Quill as witness. September sun warm across the back of my neck, halyards knocking against aluminum masts the length of the marina. He asked one question before I stepped off the dock. Why Alaska? I thought about a cave that smelled of smoke and salt, about a woman who had studied me for 2 full days before deciding I was worth the effort of saving. About currents that don't appear on any chart drafted by men who mistake documentation for knowledge. Because at sea, I said, I always knew exactly who I was. He nodded like that was a sufficient answer. For a man who has spent his life on the water, it is. In October, I found the journal. A storage box at the back of the workshop behind the house, the same workshop where 3 months before Alaska, I had recalibrated the satellite module inside my grandfather's watch. I had been clearing the space methodically back then, deciding what to hold on to and what to release. 40 years of accumulated maritime life filled that room, old charts, instrument manuals, tools from my first captaincy correspondence, from shipping contacts across 3 continents. The box was cardboard sealed with tape that had gone dry and split. My handwriting on the side, personal 1978 to 1984. Inside, beneath a folded oilskin jacket and a set of brass dividers, was the journal, leather spine, cracked pages yellowed at the edges. I opened to the first entry, June 1981. I was 23 years old, 3rd officer on a bulk carrier running grain routes between Portland and Yokohama. The handwriting looked like it belonged to a stranger, confident, forward-leaning, moving too fast to shape the letters with any care. A young man's hand. Went to sea not to build an empire, but because here I know exactly who I am. I read it twice, then a 3rd time. I had written that sentence 42 years ago, a 23-year-old standing on a grain ship somewhere in the Pacific, certain of something that the next 4 decades would bury under quarterly earnings and board meetings and the slow weight of everything an empire demands. I sat in that workshop for a long time with the journal open across my knees. The watch sat on the workbench before me. My grandfather's marine chronometer leather strap replaced satellite module pulled by the FBI as evidence and returned once the case was closed. Just a watch again. Just time. What it had always been before I turned it into something more. I lifted it, felt the heft of it heavier than anything made today. Solid brass and steel, the face gone yellow with age, but the mechanism still running true. My grandfather wore it crossing the Pacific in 1951. My father wore it on freight runs to Japan. I had worn it on every voyage until I grew too important to go to sea myself. Then I wore it to an island and back. I buckled it onto my wrist and returned to my reading. Now it is December 2023, and I am sitting on the deck of the sailboat I purchased in September, the the one Lester Quill maintained with integrity and sold with fairness, anchored in the Columbia River estuary as the winter light dies early and cold across the water. The journal is below in the cabin. I have read every word of it. A young man's record of learning the sea set down in the years before Nolan was born, before the corporation swallowed everything whole, before I lost track of the sentence I wrote at 23. Cole has a court date in February. The family court judge will review the guardianship arrangement and determine long-term placement. Petra has filed documentation establishing the trust, the conservation commitment, my financial stability, my criminal background clean, except for a single speeding citation in 1990. The judge will decide. I'm not entirely certain what I want from that decision. I know what Cole deserves. Stability, consistency, someone present in the way I was never present for his father. Whether I am capable of becoming that is a question I am still honest enough to leave open. Nolan's trial begins in March. I will testify. The 47 minutes of audio will be entered into evidence. I will sit in a federal courtroom and listen as prosecutors play my son's voice confessing to my planned murder, and then I will answer questions under oath about the father I was and the man he became. I am not looking forward to it. I am not running from it either. The anchor line shifts in the current. Somewhere across the estuary, a container vessel is working its way south through the channel toward the port. I can make out its lights moving slow and steady. The way heavy vessels always move deliberate, requiring patience. I used to own ships like that. I may again someday in some form through the trust, through Corbin's stewardship of what I built. Or I may not. The corporation will go on whether I'm watching or not. That used to feel like defeat. Now it feels like the entire point. The watch on my wrist reads 7:42 p.m. December, cold, lifting off the water. I think about Mara on her island. Kagan Island, the place that gives back what was taken. Getting on with the work of surviving the way she has for 7 years. Alone by choice. Clear about who she is in the way only people who have shed everything unnecessary ever become truly clear. I find myself wondering whether she is looking at the same stars I'm watching now. I suspect she is not thinking about me at all, and that feels precisely right. I think about Cole asking about the shark and the absolute certainty in his nod when I told him the shark lost. I think about the first entry in a leather journal written by a 23-year-old in 1981. And how many years it took me to find my way back to understanding what he meant. If you are reading this, if you have stayed with this story through all its length and weight, you hold something I did not have at 40 or 50 or 60. You have the account of a man who learned too late what he should have known early. Pay attention to the people who ask you questions about storms, not the question itself, the fact that they are asking, that they are standing beside you looking at the same sky, wanting to understand what you understand. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. The rest is just shipping. Mind how you go, and to you who have listened, remember this. When someone you trust begins behaving differently, trust that instinct. Don't repeat my mistake. I spent 40 years constructing an empire while my son slipped away from me degree by degree. I knew every shipping route from Portland to Singapore, but I had no idea that the boy who asked about storms had grown into a man capable of calculating my death like a line item on a balance sheet. When family changes, pay attention. Those small moments I chose not to see cost me my son. Here is what I learned. If you have assets worth protecting, find a lawyer today. Get things in writing. If people close to you are showing concern in ways that make you uneasy, trust that feeling. Remember, a grandfather's revenge against family betrayal isn't driven by anger. It's about shielding the innocent and ensuring consequences land where they belong. You cannot save someone from the choices they make for themselves. I believe I was sent to that island to be shown who I was, stripped of the empire, the title, everything I had constructed. I believe God put me through that so I could find out. That's where the story ends. Not with noise, not with rage, just a man sitting on the deck of a sailboat, a watch on his wrist, and the quiet that follows when justice finally does what it was always meant to do. This road cost me more than I can put into words. I lost the version of my son I had believed in for decades. I lost years I could have spent paying attention to the people who actually deserved it. I believe God put me on that island not to destroy me, but to burn away everything I had mistaken for what mattered. What came back from that island was something closer to the man I was supposed to be all along. The Lord's timing is not always comfortable, but it is rarely wrong. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught you anything, I hope it is this. First, if someone you love begins changing in ways that make you uneasy, stop explaining it away. That unease is information. Use it. Second, put your intentions in writing before you need to. A trust, a document, a record. Words spoken in a room disappear. Words filed with a court do not. Third, the people who test you before they trust you are often the ones worth trusting. Patience in others is not coldness, it is wisdom. Fourth, you cannot build your way to love. These father stories all carry the same wound at the center. A man who gave everything to a thing that could not love him back, and not enough to the people who could. Don't wait until an island teaches you that. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell me what it brought up for you. If you know someone carrying the weight of family betrayal, share this with them. Sometimes a story says, what we cannot. And if you want more, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge. There are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for staying the full length of this one. It means more than you know. Take care of the people beside you. Mind how you go.